The nature of genius. We live in an era when artificial intelligence defeats world champions at chess and Go, composes music, and creates art. And this forces us to ask, can a machine be a genius? And what is the nature of genius itself? What if everything we thought we knew about genius is incomplete, distorted, or perhaps entirely wrong? Today, we'll embark on a journey through history, neurobiology, genetics, and psychology. We'll meet some of humanity's greatest minds and try to understand what made them exceptional. We'll explore the following questions. What is genius? How does genius differ from talent? Is genius innate or acquired? Is there a genius gene? How do people become geniuses? Can you develop genius in yourself? Does upbringing and environment affect the development of genius? Is it true that genius is linked to madness? Is it true that many geniuses were failures in school? What are the signs that identify a genius? Are all geniuses child prodigies? In which fields does genius most often manifest? Is it true that geniuses have high IQs? How do geniuses live? Are they happy? Why were many geniuses not recognized during their lifetimes? Is there a dark side to genius? Who is considered the greatest genius in history? Are there geniuses in the modern world? Have there been female geniuses? Should society strive to cultivate geniuses? Can artificial intelligence be a genius? Where is the line between genius and hard work? Can someone be a genius in one field and ordinary in another? Part 1. Gray Matter. Imagine a brain. An ordinary human brain, about 3 pounds of pinkish gray matter covered with ridges and grooves. 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others. 100 trillion synaptic connections, more than the stars in our galaxy. And in this organ, which has the consistency of cold gelatin, the volume of a small cantaloupe, and accounts for just 2% of your body weight, something we call genius is born. Something that changes the course of history. Something that forces us to reconsider the very concept of human potential. Albert Einstein failed his entrance exams to the Zurich Polytechnic. Thomas Edison was expelled from school as unteachable. Vincent van Gogh sold only one painting during his lifetime. Nikola Tesla died in poverty in a New York City hotel room. Emily Dickinson published only 10 poems during her lifetime out of nearly 1,800 she wrote. Franz Kafka instructed that all his manuscripts be burned. Johann Sebastian Bach was almost forgotten for 70 years after his death. Gregor Mendel, who discovered the laws of heredity, never learned that his work would forever change biology. What unites these people? What distinguishes them from billions of other members of our species? Why are some brains capable of seeing what's invisible to everyone else, hearing music in the silence of mathematical formulas, finding order in chaos and chaos in order? And the most important question, the one that has haunted humanity since we became aware of our own existence, can we become like them? Or is genius a lottery ticket in the DNA draw that either comes up at birth or doesn't? You probably think you know the answer. You've read articles about the 10,000-hour rule. You've heard that Mozart started composing at age 5. You've seen movies about mad scientists and eccentric artists. But what if everything you thought you knew about genius is wrong? What if popular notions about the nature of exceptional minds are a mix of myths, half-truths, and outright misconceptions? The neurobiology of the last 20 years has revolutionized our understanding of the human brain. Genetics has decoded the genomes of the greatest minds and discovered things no one expected. The psychology of genius has encountered paradoxes that don't fit any theory. Creativity research has shown that the connection between intelligence and creative breakthroughs is far less straightforward than our ancestors assumed. In 2012, an international team of scientists completed the largest genetic study of intelligence in human history. They analyzed the DNA of 126,000 people, searching for genes responsible for high intelligence. And what they discovered forced a rewrite of textbooks on the genetics of cognition. The results were simultaneously discouraging and inspiring, but more on that later. In 2017, researchers from Harvard Medical School studied the brains of people with exceptional abilities using functional magnetic resonance imaging. They expected to see hyperactive zones, enhanced connections, denser neural networks. Instead, they discovered something completely opposite, and this discovery changed our understanding of how the genius mind works. In 2021, a group of psychiatrists from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm published a meta-analysis of 140 studies on the connection between genius and mental disorders. The results confirmed what many had intuitively felt. There is indeed a connection between exceptional minds and madness, but not the one you might imagine, not the romantic story of the suffering artist. Something far more complex, troubling, and perhaps more hopeful. Today, we'll journey through evidence that challenges everything you knew about genius. We'll look inside Einstein's brain, literally, because after his death, his brain was removed and studied by dozens of scientists. We'll trace the genealogy of geniuses and discover remarkable patterns. We'll break down the mechanics of creative breakthroughs at the molecular level. We'll meet contemporary geniuses and ask them what it's like to live with a mind that works differently from 99% of humanity. We'll answer questions you were afraid to ask. Can you become a genius? Is there an upper limit to human intelligence? Why do some geniuses go mad while others live long and happy lives? Is there any point to early development programs? Is it true that school kills geniuses? And the most provocative question, does humanity even need geniuses anymore? Or has artificial intelligence already surpassed the best human minds? This won't be an easy journey. We'll face uncomfortable truths. We'll destroy some cherished myths. We'll acknowledge that science doesn't yet have answers to many questions. But we'll also discover something inspiring. The understanding that human potential is far broader than we're accustomed to thinking, and that the boundary between an ordinary mind and a genius one is far more permeable than it seemed just half a century ago. The history of genius is the history of humanity. Every great breakthrough, every invention, every revolution in thinking began in a single brain and then spread to billions. Fire, the wheel, writing, mathematics, philosophy, science, technology, all are the result of exceptional minds that saw what others couldn't see. To understand genius is to understand how our species evolves, to understand where we're heading, and perhaps to understand how to accelerate that journey. Get ready, we're beginning. But before we dive into scientific data and biographies of great minds, let's stop and ask the most basic question, the one that seems easiest to answer but actually stumps the best researchers, and has for several centuries. A question so fundamental that without an answer to it, all other reasoning risks becoming a game without rules. What is genius? Ask this question of 10 different people, and you'll get 10 different answers. Ask a philosopher, they'll tell you about the transcendence of the human spirit and the ability to touch eternal truths. Ask a psychologist. They'll mention IQ, creativity, divergent thinking, cognitive flexibility, and a dozen other terms, each requiring its own definition. Ask a neurobiologist. They'll start talking about neuroplasticity, myelination, synaptic efficiency, and connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. Ask a historian. They'll name names: Leonardo, Newton, Goethe, Tesla, Curie. Ask an ordinary person, and they'll probably shrug and say something like, well, it's when someone's really smart, like Einstein. And each of these answers contains a grain of truth, but none gives the complete picture. The word genius itself has a remarkable history. In ancient Rome, genius didn't mean an outstanding individual, but rather a guardian spirit present at each person's birth who accompanies them throughout life. It was a kind of guardian angel, a source of life force and inspiration. When a Roman accomplished something remarkable, the credit wasn't given to the person themselves, but to their genius, that divine spark dwelling within them. This is an important distinction. Genius wasn't a property of the person, it was a gift from above, the presence of something greater in an ordinary mortal. This concept survived for nearly 2,000 years. During the Renaissance, artists and thinkers still spoke of inspiration as the voice of a muse, a divine touch, the idea that great works weren't created by them, but through them. Michelangelo claimed he merely freed sculptures that already existed inside blocks of marble. Mozart described the process of composing music as writing down melodies he heard from somewhere outside himself. The turning point came in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment. Philosophers and scientists began to view humans as autonomous beings, capable of rational thought and self-improvement without the participation of divine forces. Genius stopped being a guardian spirit and became a property of the person themselves. Immanuel Kant, in his Critique of Judgment, defined genius as the innate mental aptitude through which nature gives the rule to art. Note that Kant still speaks of innate aptitude. The idea that genius could be developed hadn't yet emerged. In the 19th century, the concept of genius was romanticized to the extreme. The genius became an almost mythological figure, a suffering loner, misunderstood by contemporaries, consumed by the inner fire of creativity, balancing on the edge of madness. This image still lives in popular culture. The mad scientist, the eccentric artist, the reclusive inventor. But how closely does it correspond to reality? We'll return to this question later. The 20th century brought attempts at scientific measurement of genius. Alfred Binet developed the first intelligence tests. Lewis Terman adapted them for the American educational system, and the famous IQ, intelligence quotient, emerged. A seductive idea appeared. Genius can be measured by a number. IQ above 140? Gifted. Above 160? Genius. Simple, clear, scientific. But this simplicity proved deceptive. Research showed that the connection between IQ and life achievements is far from straightforward. Many people with very high IQs achieved nothing remarkable. Many recognized geniuses had IQs below the genius threshold. Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate in physics and one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, had an IQ of 125, high but not exceptional. William Shockley, inventor of the transistor and also a Nobel laureate, had an IQ of 129. Meanwhile, Marilyn Vos Savant, the woman with the highest IQ ever recorded, 228 on the scale used at the time, is known primarily for writing a column in Parade magazine and solving logic puzzles. Important accomplishments, no doubt, but not the scale we associate with the word genius. By the end of the 20th century, it became clear that IQ is just one of many factors. Psychologist Howard Gardner proposed the theory of multiple intelligences, identifying 8 different types: linguistic, logical mathematical, musical, bodily kinesthetic, spatial, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. Later he added a 9th, existential. According to this theory, genius can manifest in any of these areas, and a person who is a genius in one sphere may be mediocre in another. Other researchers focused on creativity as a key component of genius. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi studied flow state, a special state of consciousness in which a person is completely immersed in an activity, loses track of time, and reaches peak productivity. He found that outstanding creators are able to enter this state more often and more deeply than ordinary people. Robert Sternberg developed the triarchic theory of intelligence, identifying analytical, creative, and practical components. In his view, genius requires an outstanding level in all three. It's not enough to come up with a genius idea. You need to analyze it, develop it, and bring it to reality. Dean Keith Simonton, one of the leading researchers on genius, studied the biographies of more than 2,000 outstanding individuals and concluded that genius is not a single trait, but a constellation of many factors: intelligence, creativity, persistence, access to resources, favorable timing, luck, and much more. He also noted the Matthew effect. Those who achieve early success get more opportunities for further achievements, and the gap with peers only widens. Today, in the 21st century, we have a more comprehensive understanding of genius than ever before. Neurobiology has shown us how the brains of exceptional people work. Genetics has identified hundreds of genes, each contributing a tiny bit to intellectual abilities. Psychology has described the cognitive styles and strategies characteristic of geniuses. Sociology has demonstrated the role of environment, culture, and historical moment. And yet we have no single definition of genius. Perhaps there can't be one, because genius, like beauty, is partly in the eye of the beholder. What one era considers genius, another may reject as delusion. What is valued in one culture may be misunderstood in another. But for the purposes of our journey, let's adopt a working definition. Genius is the ability to create something fundamentally new and significant that changes the way other people think or act. This definition includes several key elements: novelty, a genius does what no one has done before; significance, this is not just originality for its own sake, but a contribution valued by others; and influence, the genius's work spreads beyond their personal sphere. By this definition, genius is not merely a property of mind, but the result of interaction between mind, activity, and society. One can have genius potential and never realize it. One can create genius work and die unrecognized. One can be recognized as a genius during one's lifetime and forgotten after death. Genius is a dynamic process, not a static state. And this brings us to the next question, which we'll examine in detail. How does genius differ from talent? These two concepts are often used as synonyms, but there's a substantial difference between them. A difference that may determine how we view our own potential and the potential of our children. But that's already the topic of the next part of our journey. For now, remember the main thing. Genius is not magic, not a gift from the gods, not a genetic lottery. It's a complex phenomenon that we're only beginning to understand. And the deeper we dig, the more we discover that the boundary between genius and ordinary person is much more blurred than it seems. Part 2. What is genius? A deep dive. Let's now dive deeper into the anatomy of genius. We've established a working definition, but it's too general to be useful. We need to understand the mechanics. How exactly does a genius mind work differently? What happens in a person's head when they make a discovery that will change the world? Let's begin with a story that illustrates the nature of genius insight better than any theory. August, 1865. German chemist Friedrich August Kekule is sitting by the fireplace in his study in Ghent. He's working on the structure of benzene, a molecule that defies his understanding. Benzene has the formula C6H6, 6 carbon atoms and 6 hydrogen atoms. But how are they connected? All the structures Kekule knows don't work. If the carbons are connected in a chain, there aren't enough hydrogens. If there are double bonds, the properties should be different. The puzzle seems unsolvable. Kekule dozes off. He has a dream. Atoms dance before his eyes, forming long chains, writhing like snakes. And suddenly, one of the snakes grabs its own tail, forming a ring. Kekule wakes with a start. A ring! Benzene is a ring! 6 carbon atoms connected in a closed structure. This discovery changed organic chemistry. The benzene ring structure became the key to understanding a huge class of compounds, aromatic substances. Without it, there would be no modern pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, or synthetic materials. And it came in a dream. What happened here from the perspective of cognitive science? Kekule's brain was working on the problem at conscious and unconscious levels simultaneously. Conscious thinking, linear, logical, sequential, had hit a dead end. But the unconscious continued processing information, searching for connections, combining elements. In sleep, when conscious control weakened, the unconscious solution broke through into consciousness in the form of a visual image. This phenomenon, sudden realization, the eureka moment, insight, has been studied by cognitive psychologists for over 100 years, and we now know much more about it than in Kekule's time. In 2004, neurobiologists Mark Young-Beeman and Edward Bowden conducted an elegant experiment. They gave subjects remote association tasks, 3 words, for example, pine, crab, sauce, and you have to find a 4th word that connects to all 3. The answer: apple, pineapple, crabapple, applesauce. Participants solved problems while inside an MRI scanner. Researchers discovered that a moment before insight, 300 milliseconds before the subject pressed a button signaling they'd found the answer, a burst of gamma wave activity occurred in the right hemisphere of the brain, in the anterior superior temporal gyrus. This was literally a flash of insight, a measurable neural event. But what was even more interesting was another discovery. A second and a half before this gamma flash, a burst of alpha waves was observed over the right visual cortex. Alpha waves are associated with suppression of sensory input. The brain was essentially closing its eyes to focus on internal processes. In other words, before insight, the brain temporarily disconnected from the external world to hear the quiet voice of the unconscious solution. This explains why many creative insights occur in states of relaxation, in the shower, on a walk, before sleep. When the conscious mind is distracted or relaxed, unconscious processes get a chance to break through to consciousness. But the capacity for insights is just one aspect of genius. Another, equally important, is what psychologists call divergent thinking, the ability to generate many different ideas, approaches, and solutions. The classic test for divergent thinking: name as many unusual uses for a brick as you can. An ordinary person will name 5 to 10. Construction, weapon, doorstop, weight. A person with high divergent thinking will name 30 to 50. A brick as a drawing tool, as a musical instrument, if you tap on it, as an ice mold, as a sculpture element, as a fishing sinker, as a paper press, as exercise equipment, as a game projectile, as material to grind into powder and use as pigment. Research shows that divergent thinking correlates moderately with IQ. Approximately R equals 0.2 to 0.3. But it's a separate ability that can be trained and developed. Creative geniuses, artists, writers, inventors, typically have very high levels of divergent thinking. Scientific geniuses, mathematicians, physicists, often combine high divergent thinking with high convergent thinking, the ability to find the single correct answer. Now let's look at genius from another angle, the productivity side. Dean Keith Simonton, whom I've already mentioned, studied the careers of hundreds of outstanding creators and discovered a remarkable pattern. The probability of creating a masterpiece is directly proportional to the total number of works created. In other words, geniuses don't hit the target more often. They simply shoot more often. Thomas Edison received 1,093 patents. Most of them led to nothing significant. But among them were the phonograph, the electric light bulb, and the motion picture camera. Pablo Picasso created about 50,000 works: paintings, drawings, sculptures, ceramics. Most of them are not masterpieces. But among them are Guernica, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and Girl on a Ball. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote more than 1,000 musical compositions. Shakespeare, 37 plays and 154 sonnets. Simonton calls this the equal odds rule. Regardless of career stage, each new work by a creator has roughly the same probability of becoming a masterpiece. From this follows a simple but important conclusion. If you want to create something genius, create a lot. Quantity will eventually lead to quality. But where does this productivity come from? Why are some people able to work with unrelenting intensity for decades, while others quickly burn out? Here we approach yet another component of genius, motivation. More precisely, a special type of motivation that psychologists call intrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is when you do something for the sake of the process itself, because it brings satisfaction, interest, joy. Extrinsic motivation is when you do something for a reward, money, fame, recognition, grades. Research consistently shows that intrinsic motivation is associated with higher creativity and productivity in the long term. Geniuses are obsessed with their work, not in a pathological sense, but in the sense of deep engagement. Einstein could think about physics while playing violin, while walking, while shaving. Darwin spent 20 years collecting data and thinking about evolution before publishing on the origin of species. Marie Curie worked in an unheated shed with radioactive materials, endangering her health because she couldn't do otherwise. This obsession is not a consequence of willpower or self-discipline. Geniuses don't force themselves to work. They can't not work. For them, work is not labor, but a source of deep satisfaction. Where does such passion come from? Partly it seems to be innate. Some people are naturally inclined toward intense focus on objects that interest them. Partly it's formed in childhood, through early experiences that connect a particular activity with positive emotions. And partly it depends on fit, on whether a person has found a field that resonates with their natural inclinations and abilities. Now let's talk about a less obvious but critically important aspect of genius: context. Geniuses don't emerge in a vacuum. They're products of their time, their culture, their social environment. Renaissance Florence gave the world Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Botticelli, a disproportionate number of geniuses for a city with a population of less than 100,000. Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, produced Freud, Mahler, Klimt, Wittgenstein, Schumpeter. Silicon Valley, over the past half-century, has given the world a revolution in information technology. What do these places and eras have in common? Concentration of talented people. Wealth that allows for creative work. Cultural openness to new ideas. Institutions, universities, workshops, laboratories, companies that support innovation. Systems of patronage or funding. And perhaps most importantly, an atmosphere in which ambition and originality are encouraged, not suppressed. Sociologist Randall Collins analyzed networks of influence among great philosophers and discovered that most of them were connected to each other, directly or through one or two intermediaries. Geniuses learned from geniuses, argued with geniuses, were inspired by geniuses. Isolation is the enemy of genius. This brings us to a paradox. Geniuses are individualists. They think differently from everyone else. They go against the current. But at the same time, they need community, not to follow it, but to have something to push against, someone to contradict, someone to surpass. Let's summarize what we've learned about the components of genius. First, cognitive abilities: intelligence, divergent thinking, capacity for insight, working memory, cognitive flexibility. Second, motivation: intrinsic passion, obsession with the subject, capacity for sustained focus. Third, productivity: willingness to work hard, to create a large volume of work, to experiment and fail. Fourth, context. Access to knowledge, resources, community, a cultural environment that supports innovation. Fifth, luck and timing. Being in the right place at the right time, when the problem has ripened for solution and society is ready to accept the new. The absence of any of these elements can prevent the realization of genius potential. A smart person without motivation won't create anything significant. A motivated person without abilities will beat against the ceiling of their capabilities. An able and motivated person in the wrong environment may be suppressed or ignored. And even with all prerequisites in place, a measure of luck is needed for the idea to come at the right time, for the work to be noticed, for history to turn the right way. This understanding is simultaneously sobering and inspiring. Sobering because it shows how many factors must align for genius to manifest. Inspiring because it shows that many of these factors are subject to influence. We can develop cognitive abilities. We can seek out and cultivate passion. We can learn to be productive. We can choose environments that support our ambitions. But before we move on to practical questions, we need to consider one more important distinction. A distinction that's often blurred in everyday speech, but has fundamental significance for understanding human potential. How does genius differ from talent? Part 3. Genius and talent. What's the difference? At first glance, talent and genius are synonyms. We say talented musician and genius musician, meaning roughly the same thing, a person who does something exceptionally well. But on closer examination, a deep difference emerges between these concepts. A difference not only in degree, but in the very nature of abilities. Let's start with etymology. The word talent comes from the ancient Greek talanton, which originally meant a unit of weight and later a large sum of money. In the New Testament, there's the parable of the talents. A master gave his servants different numbers of talents, money, and demanded an accounting of how they used them. Those who multiplied their talents were rewarded. The one who buried his talent in the ground was punished. Hence the metaphorical meaning. Talent is a gift that must be developed. The word genius, as we've already discussed, goes back to the Latin genius, a guardian spirit. If talent is capital that can be multiplied or spent, then genius is the presence of something transcendent, a touch from another dimension. Already in the etymology, a key distinction is embedded. Talent is potential that can be developed. Genius is something more than just developed potential. Let's try to understand this distinction more systematically. Talent is a natural inclination toward a particular type of activity combined with the ability to quickly master the corresponding skills. A talented pianist easily memorizes musical works, quickly develops technique, intuitively understands the structure of music. A talented mathematician grasps abstract concepts where others see only symbols. A talented athlete has advantageous biomechanics, fast reactions, efficient coordination. Talent is an advantage at the starting line. It's the ability to move faster and further in a particular direction. But talent by itself doesn't guarantee outstanding results. The world is full of talented people who achieve nothing. And conversely, many successful people admit they weren't particularly talented at the beginning of their journey. Genius is something different. It's not simply talent taken to the maximum. It's a qualitatively different level of achievement, characterized by fundamental novelty. Here's the key distinction. A talented person does the existing better. A genius does what didn't exist before. A talented pianist plays Chopin better than other pianists. A genius composer writes music that no one has heard before, that changes the very understanding of what music can be. A talented physicist solves complex problems within existing theories. A genius physicist creates new theories that overturn our understanding of reality. This distinction can be expressed through the concept of paradigm, introduced by philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn. Normal science is work within an accepted paradigm, solving puzzles, improving existing models. Scientific revolution is a paradigm shift, a transition to a fundamentally new way of seeing the world. Talent works within the paradigm. Genius creates a new paradigm. Consider a concrete example. In late 19th century physics, there were many talented scientists solving problems within the framework of classical mechanics and electrodynamics. They achieved important results, made valuable discoveries. But Albert Einstein did something different. He showed that time and space are relative, that mass is equivalent to energy, that gravity is the curvature of space-time. He didn't improve existing physics, he created a new one. Another example. In 19th century music, there were many talented romantic composers who wrote beautiful, emotional music within the established tonal language. But Arnold Schoenberg develops 12-tone technique, a fundamentally new system for organizing sounds that destroyed traditional hierarchy and opened the path to 20th century atonal music. You can debate whether you like his music, but you can't deny that he changed the very nature of musical thinking. Yet another example. In painting, there were many talented realist artists who perfected the technique of depicting the visible world. But Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque created Cubism, a new way of seeing and depicting reality that influenced all of 20th century art. It's important to understand, the boundary between talent and genius is not quantitative, but qualitative. It's not a question of more or better, it's a question of different. Talent can be measured and compared. This pianist plays more technically perfectly than that one. This chess player has a higher rating. This programmer solves problems faster. Genius can't be compared this way because a genius creates their own criteria. How do you judge who is more genius, Bach or Beethoven? Einstein or Darwin? Shakespeare or Tolstoy? These are meaningless questions because each of them created something unique, irreducible to a common denominator. Now, let's consider the relationship between talent and genius. Does genius require talent? At first glance, yes. It's hard to imagine a musical genius without musical ear, or a mathematical genius without the capacity for abstract thinking. But history knows cases that make us doubt this simple scheme. Ludwig van Beethoven lost his hearing, but continued composing music, and some of his late works are considered among the greatest in history. Jorge Luis Borges went blind, but continued writing stories, dictating them to secretaries. Stephen Hawking was paralyzed and could communicate only through a speech synthesizer, yet made breakthroughs in theoretical physics. These examples show that genius is not simply a sum of talents. It's something that can manifest even with serious limitations, if that elusive quality is present, the ability to see the world differently. On the other hand, talent doesn't guarantee genius. History knows many child prodigies, children with exceptional abilities, who didn't become geniuses. They grew into talented, successful professionals, but didn't make revolutionary discoveries. Why? Here we return to the components we discussed earlier. Genius requires not only abilities, but also motivation, productivity, context, luck. Talent is a necessary but insufficient condition. There's another important distinction between talent and genius, their relationship to rules. A talented person masters rules faster and applies them more effectively than others. A talented chess player knows all the openings and endgames, understands principles of strategy, sees tactical combinations. They play by the rules, but play superbly. A genius rewrites the rules. Garry Kasparov didn't just play chess well. He changed the understanding of what chess strategy is. His aggressive, dynamic style forced a reconsideration of established principles. He broke rules, and 1. In science, a talented researcher solves problems within accepted methodology. A genius researcher invents new methods, new questions, new ways of interpreting data. In art, a talented artist masterfully commands the technique of their era. A genius artist creates a new technique, a new style, a new language. This doesn't mean that a genius ignores rules. On the contrary, to productively break rules, you must first deeply master them. Picasso started as a classically trained artist and could draw with academic perfection. Schoenberg was a master of late Romantic harmony. Einstein had an excellent knowledge of classical physics. The principle: first master the rules, then transcend them. Now let's turn to the psychological distinction between talent and genius. Talent is often associated with ease. For a talented person, something comes easily. They learn quickly, grasp intuitively, achieve results without visible effort. Talent is a gift that simplifies the path. Genius, by contrast, is often linked to struggle. Geniuses describe their creative process as agonizing, exhausting, full of doubts and failures. Flaubert rewrote each page dozens of times. Beethoven covered sheets with sketches, crossed them out, started over. Darwin doubted his theory for decades. This is a paradox. Genius, which seems to us a manifestation of supreme ease, is actually often born in torment. What looks like inspiration is the result of long, persistent work. Mozart, often cited as an example of pure genius, actually worked more intensively than most of his contemporaries. He just did it with pleasure. Here lies an important thought. Genius is not an alternative to work, but its highest form. A genius doesn't work less than a talented person. They work more, but differently. Their work is directed not at perfecting the existing, but at creating the new. Let's consider one more aspect of the distinction, the social dimension. Talent is a socially recognizable category. Society knows how to recognize and reward talent. There are competitions, Olympiads, rankings, evaluation systems. A talented child gets good grades, wins competitions, receives scholarships. Genius is a socially problematic category. Society often doesn't know how to relate to geniuses. Their new ideas are frightening. Their strange behavior is irritating. Their unwillingness to follow norms is perceived as a threat. Many geniuses were rejected, ridiculed, persecuted during their lifetimes. Galileo Galilei was forced to recant his ideas under pressure from the Inquisition. Ignaz Semmelweis, who proposed hand-washing to prevent childbed fever, was mocked by colleagues and died in a psychiatric hospital. Alan Turing, father of computer science, was subjected to chemical castration for homosexuality and died by suicide. Talent fits into the system. Genius often destroys it. This distinction explains why talented people are often more successful during their lifetimes than geniuses. Talent is understandable, measurable, socially acceptable. Genius is unpredictable, immeasurable, often antisocial. Let's summarize. Talent and genius are not points on the same scale, but different dimensions of human capability. Talent is potential for mastering existing skills and knowledge. Genius is the ability to create the fundamentally new. Talent does better. Genius does differently. Talent masters rules. Genius rewrites rules. Talent is measurable. Genius is unique. Talent is socially recognized. Genius is often socially problematic. But here a fundamental question arises, one that has concerned humanity since ancient times. Where do these abilities, talent and genius, come from? Are they a gift of nature, the result of upbringing, or a combination of both? We're moving to one of the most heated debates in the science of humanity, the nature versus nurture controversy, about the innate and the acquired. Is genius innate or acquired? Part 4. Innate or acquired? The great debate. This question has haunted humanity since we began reflecting on ourselves. Why does one child grasp everything instantly, while another struggles with the simplest tasks? Why is a genius born in one family and not another? Why don't genius parents always have genius children? The answer we give to this question has enormous practical consequences. If genius is innate, it can't be created, only discovered. Education becomes sorting. Identify the gifted, give them resources, don't waste effort on the rest. If genius is acquirable, everyone potentially can become a genius under the right conditions. Education becomes gardening. Create conditions in which abilities can flourish. This dichotomy, nature versus nurture, has structured debates for centuries. And, as we'll see, it turned out to be false. Reality is much more complex and interesting. Let's start with the history of this debate. In ancient Greece, the view that abilities were innate prevailed. Plato believed that souls have different natures. Some are destined from birth to be philosophers, others warriors, still others craftsmen. Education is not the creation of abilities, but the recollection of what the soul already knows from previous incarnations. This idea dominated Western culture until the Enlightenment. The aristocracy believed in blue blood, the conviction that noble birth brings noble qualities. Genius was considered a gift from God that either exists or doesn't. The turning point came in the 17th century. John Locke proposed the concept of tabula rasa, the blank slate. According to this idea, the human mind at birth is a blank sheet on which experience writes all content. No innate ideas, no predetermined abilities. Everything is the product of upbringing and environment. This idea became the philosophical foundation of the Enlightenment and later of liberal democracy. If people are born equal, differences between them are the result of circumstances. Therefore, by changing circumstances, you can change the person. Therefore, social reforms and education can improve society. In the 19th century, the pendulum swung back. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and the concept of heredity became central to understanding living beings. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, applied evolutionary ideas to human abilities. In the book Hereditary Genius, 1869, he analyzed the family trees of outstanding people and concluded that genius is inherited. Galton noticed that great people often come from families where there are other great people. The Bachs were a family of musicians. Johann Sebastian was merely the most famous of many. The Darwins were a family of scientists. Charles's father was a physician and naturalist, his grandfather Erasmus a famous intellectual, his son George an astronomer. Among British judges, sons of judges are disproportionately represented. Galton founded eugenics, a movement for improving the human breed through controlled reproduction. This idea had catastrophic consequences in the 20th century, from forced sterilization of the unfit in the United States and Scandinavia to Nazi racial hygiene programs. But was Galton's original idea correct, that genius is inherited? The problem with his analysis is obvious to modern readers. He conflated biological inheritance with social inheritance. A judge's son becomes a judge not because he inherited jurisprudence genes, but because he grew up in a lawyer's family, had access to education, connections, resources. Bach's sons became musicians not because they inherited a music gene, but because from childhood they lived in a house where music was played, received lessons from their father, had access to instruments. Correlation between parents and children doesn't prove genetic inheritance if there's a shared environment. In the 20th century, scientists developed methods to separate the influence of genes and environment. The main one is twin studies. The idea is simple. Identical twins have identical genes. Fraternal twins share about 50%, like ordinary siblings. If a trait correlates more strongly in identical twins than in fraternal twins, this indicates a genetic contribution. Even more informative are studies of twins separated at birth and raised in different families. If such twins resemble each other, this can't be explained by shared environment, only by shared genes. The most famous such study is the Minnesota study of twins reared apart, MISTRA, conducted from 1979 to 1999. Researchers found and tested 137 pairs of twins separated in infancy. The results astonished the scientific community. Identical twins who had never met each other turned out to be remarkably similar. Not just in appearance, that's understandable, but in character, habits, preferences. There were cases where twins raised on different continents wore identical mustaches, preferred the same brands of cigarettes, married women with the same names, gave their dogs the same names. And, especially important for our topic, their IQ test results correlated at the level of 0.70. This means that 70% of differences in IQ between people are explained by genetic factors. For comparison, the IQ correlation for identical twins raised together was 0.86. There's a difference, but it's not as large as one might expect. These results sparked a storm of controversy. Critics pointed to methodological problems. Perhaps the separated twins weren't actually completely separated. Some were raised by relatives, some met in childhood. Perhaps adoption agencies placed twins in similar families. Perhaps twins' physical resemblance evoked similar treatment from those around them. But subsequent studies in Sweden, Denmark, Australia, Britain confirmed the main conclusion. Genes play a substantial role in intellectual abilities. The modern consensus estimate of IQ heritability is 50 to 80%, depending on age, heritability increases with age, and population. What does this mean? Let's clarify, because heritability statistics are often misunderstood. Heritability of 50% does not mean that your intelligence is 50% determined by genes and 50% by environment. It means that 50% of the differences between people in a given population are explained by genetic differences. If everyone grew up under identical conditions, heritability would be 100%. All differences would be genetic. If everyone had identical genes, heritability would be 0. All differences would be explained by environment. Heritability is a property of a population, not an individual. It says what proportion of variation is explained by genes. But for a specific person, you can't say, your IQ is 70% genetic. Genes and environment interact in complex ways, and separating their contributions for an individual is impossible. Moreover, high heritability doesn't mean a trait can't be changed by environment. The classic example is height. Height has very high heritability, about 90% in developed countries. But average population height has increased by 4 to 6 inches over the last 100 years, thanks to improved nutrition and healthcare. Genes determine differences between individuals, but environment determines the average level. The same is true for intelligence. The Flynn effect, discovered by New Zealand political scientist James Flynn, shows that average IQ in developed countries rose by about 3 points per decade throughout the 20th century. This is too fast for genetic changes. The cause must be environmental. Better nutrition, fewer infectious diseases, more cognitive stimulation, better education, all of this raises the intellectual level of the population. So, the first important conclusion, genes play a substantial role in intellectual abilities, but environment matters too, and even highly heritable traits can be changed by environmental interventions. But intelligence is not the same as genius. We've already discussed that genius requires not only high intelligence, but also creativity, motivation, productivity, favorable context. What do we know about the heritability of these qualities? Creativity has been studied less than intelligence, but available data indicate moderate heritability, about 20 to 40%. This is less than for IQ, suggesting a greater role for environment. Personality traits, such as openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, have heritability of about 40 to 60%. Interestingly, openness to experience, the trait most associated with creativity and achievements in art, has moderate heritability, leaving significant room for environmental influence. Motivation and persistence, key components of success, are even harder to analyze. Psychologist Angela Duckworth introduced the concept of grit, a combination of passion and perseverance in pursuing long-term goals. Her research shows that grit is moderately heritable but is significantly shaped by experience. Now let's turn to research that directly studies geniuses, biographical and genealogical analyses. Francis Galton, as we mentioned, found that genius clusters in certain families. This observation has been confirmed by later research. Relatives of geniuses are more likely to themselves possess outstanding abilities. But here we face a chicken and egg problem. Families that produce geniuses differ from ordinary families not only in genes, but in environment. Children in such families have access to books, education, intellectual conversations. They have role models demonstrating that intellectual achievements are possible and valuable. They inherit not only genes, but cultural capital. Researchers have tried to separate these influences using sophisticated statistical methods. Results are mixed, but the overall picture is this. Both genes and environment make substantial contributions, and they're hard to separate because they correlate and interact. This brings us to one of the most important ideas in modern behavioral genetics, the concept of gene-environment correlation. The essence is simple. Genes influence not only abilities directly, but also what environment a person chooses and creates for themselves. Imagine a child with a natural inclination toward music. They enjoy listening to melodies, quickly memorize songs, are drawn to musical instruments. Parents notice the interest and enroll them in music school. Teachers see their abilities and give them more attention. They enjoy practice and practice more than peers. Their environment becomes increasingly musical, not by chance, but because their genes direct them toward this environment. This mechanism is called active gene-environment correlation. A person actively seeks an environment matching their genetic predispositions. There's also passive correlation. Parents transmit both genes and environment to children, and these influences act in the same direction. Musically gifted parents transmit both music genes and a musical environment. And there's reactive or evocative correlation. A child's genetically influenced traits evoke certain reactions from others. A curious child gets more answers to their questions, which further develops their curiosity. These correlations mean that a simple division into genes and environment doesn't work. Genes influence environment. Environment activates certain genes, and they intertwine in a complex dance of development. Modern epigenetics adds another layer of complexity. Epigenetic mechanisms, DNA methylation, histone modifications, regulate gene activity, and these mechanisms are influenced by environment. Experience can turn on and turn off genes, and some of these changes can be passed to future generations. This means the boundary between innate and acquired blurs. What you experience can change the expression of your genes. What your parents and even grandparents experienced can affect your biology. So, is genius innate or acquired? The answer? Neither one nor the other, and both. Genius requires certain biological prerequisites. Without certain cognitive abilities, without a certain nervous system structure, genius is impossible. In this sense, it's innate. But these prerequisites are not genius itself. They're potential that may or may not be realized, depending on environment, experience, training, motivation, luck. In this sense, genius is acquirable, or more precisely, constructible. The best metaphor is seed and soil. A seed contains the genetic program of a plant, but the plant isn't contained in the seed. It arises in the process of growth. And this growth depends on soil, water, light, temperature. In poor conditions, even the best seed won't produce a healthy plant. In good conditions, even a modest seed can yield an abundant harvest. Genius is not a property of the seed and not a property of the soil. It's a property of the interaction between them. This perspective frees us from the false dichotomy. We don't need to choose between genetic determinism, geniuses are born, and environmental optimism, geniuses are made. The truth is more complex and interesting. Genius is the result of complex development in which genes and environment are inextricably intertwined. But which genes exactly are involved in this process? Is there a genius gene? That's the question we'll turn to in the next part. Part 5. Is there a genius gene? In 1999, mice were born in a Princeton University laboratory that would change neuroscience. Their creator, neuroscientist Joe Sien, named them Doogie, after the character from the hit TV series Doogie Howser, MD, the brilliant kid who picked up everything instantly. The Doogie mice were genetically modified. An extra copy of the NMDA receptor gene, a protein that plays a key role in learning and memory, had been inserted into their genome. The results exceeded expectations. Doogie mice learned faster, remembered better, and solved mazes more efficiently than their ordinary counterparts. They were, if you will, genius mice. The media exploded with headlines. Intelligence gene found. Soon we'll be able to create geniuses. Genetic human enhancement, it's real. It seemed the dream, or nightmare, of eugenics was close to becoming reality. But reality turned out to be more complicated. Much more complicated. First, mice aren't humans. A mouse's cognitive abilities involve finding food and avoiding predators. Human cognitive abilities involve language, mathematics, art, science, philosophy. Extrapolating from mice to humans is a dangerous game. Second, single gene effects are the exception, not the rule. Most complex traits, and intelligence is definitely one of them, are determined not by one gene, but by thousands. Each gene makes a tiny contribution, and the total effect depends on the combination. Third, genes don't work in isolation. They interact with each other and with the environment. A gene that's beneficial in one context can be harmful in another. The Doogie mice had side effects: heightened sensitivity to pain and greater susceptibility to certain types of brain damage. So what does science actually say about the genetics of intelligence and genius? Let's start with what we know for certain. Intelligence is a polygenic trait. This means it's determined not by one gene, but by many, from hundreds to thousands. Each gene makes a small contribution, typically less than 1 IQ point. The early searches for an intelligence gene were disappointing. In the 1990s and 2000s, researchers conducted candidate gene studies. They'd pick a gene that theoretically could affect brain function, for example, a dopamine receptor gene, and test whether it was linked to IQ. Results were contradictory. One experiment showed a connection, the next didn't. Meta-analyses revealed that most initial findings were false positives, the result of statistical flukes. The breakthrough came in the 2010s with the advent of genome-wide association studies, or GWAS. Instead of testing individual genes, GWAS scans the entire genome, looking for variants that are statistically associated with a trait. In 2018, the largest GWAS of intelligence was published, an analysis of DNA from over 1 million people. Researchers discovered more than 1,000 genetic variants associated with educational attainment, an indirect measure of intelligence, and about 500 variants directly associated with cognitive test scores. What are these genes? Many of them are involved in nervous system development, synapse formation, and neural signal transmission. Some affect myelination, the process of coating nerve fibers with an insulating sheath that speeds up signal transmission. Others are linked to neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change its structure in response to experience. But here's what's crucial to understand. Each of these variants makes a tiny contribution. The strongest effects amount to fractions of a single IQ point. To explain the differences between people, you need to sum up thousands of these small effects. Researchers have learned to create polygenic scores, or polygenic risk scores, the sum of effects from all known genetic variants. These scores can predict IQ and educational attainment better than any single gene, but they still explain only 10 to 15% of the variation, far short of the theoretical 50 to 80% heritability. Why the gap? Several reasons. First, not all genetic variants have been discovered yet. Even larger samples are needed. Second, some heritability is explained by rare variants that are hard to detect statistically. Third, some is explained by interactions between genes, epistasis, which are even harder to capture. Fourth, current methods don't detect all types of genetic variation. But let's return to our main question. Is there a genius gene? The answer is a resounding no. If by that we mean a single gene that makes someone a genius. Such a gene doesn't exist, and by all appearances, cannot exist. Genius is too complex a phenomenon to be encoded by a single gene. It requires a combination of many abilities: intelligence, creativity, memory, attention, motivation, emotional resilience. Each of these abilities is itself polygenic. Their combination is astronomically complex. But can we talk about a genetic profile of genius? A specific combination of variants that increases the probability of genius-level achievements? Theoretically, yes. Practically, we're very far from understanding such a profile. Several attempts have been made to study the genomes of exceptional people. In 2014, the Chinese company BGI launched a project to sequence the DNA of people with very high IQs. The project sparked ethical debates and has yet to yield significant results. Other researchers have studied the genetics of specific abilities linked to genius. For example, musical ability has a heritability of around 40 to 70%. Several genetic variants have been discovered that are associated with perfect pitch and the ability to distinguish tones. But from genes to Mozart's genius, that's a chasm science cannot yet bridge. An interesting study was conducted on Albert Einstein's brain. After the physicist's death in 1955, his brain was removed, without family consent, which caused a scandal, and studied by several generations of scientists. What did they find? Einstein's brain was average-sized, 1,230 grams, slightly below average for men, 1,400 grams. This immediately refuted the naive notion that genius is a matter of having a big brain. But more detailed analysis revealed differences. Einstein's parietal lobes, areas associated with spatial reasoning and mathematical ability, were 15% wider than average. Part of the Sylvian fissure was missing, which may have allowed neurons in that area to communicate more efficiently. Glial cells, the brain's support cells, were present in unusually high numbers in areas associated with computational abilities. These findings are interesting, but their interpretation is questionable. We don't know whether these features were the cause of Einstein's genius, a consequence of his intense thinking about physics, or simply random variations unrelated to his achievements. A study of one brain is an anecdote, not statistics. More systematic MRI studies of highly intelligent people's brains yield mixed results. Some studies find connections between IQ and gray matter volume, cortical thickness, or efficiency of connections between brain regions. But the effects are usually small, and there's significant overlap between highly intelligent and average brains. What can we say with certainty? First, genius has a genetic component. Genes influence brain development, cognitive abilities, and personality traits that contribute to achievement. Second, this genetic component is not one magic gene, but a complex combination of thousands of genes, each making a small contribution. Third, genes are necessary but not sufficient. They create potential but don't guarantee its realization. Fourth, modern genetics cannot predict genius from DNA and probably never will with high accuracy. Too much depends on environment, experience, and chance. Fifth, the idea of genetic enhancement of intelligence creating designer geniuses, remains science fiction. Even if we knew all the genes affecting intelligence, modifying them would carry unpredictable risks. There's another important aspect often overlooked in discussions of the genetics of genius, the evolutionary one. If genius is so useful, and the achievements of geniuses certainly benefit society, why didn't evolution make us all geniuses? There are several answers. First, genius is a rare trait, and rare traits spread slowly through a population, even if they're advantageous. Second, a big brain has costs. It requires a lot of energy, about 20% of the body's metabolism. It requires a long childhood, a period of vulnerability when the child depends on adult care. It requires complicated births. A large head has difficulty passing through the birth canal. Third, in our evolutionary past, genius in the modern sense may not have been particularly useful. A hunter-gatherer needed practical survival skills, not the ability to do abstract mathematics. Genius is a product of civilization, and civilization is a very recent phenomenon on an evolutionary timescale. Fourth, and this is speculative but interesting, genius may be linked to certain costs that balance its benefits. We'll return to this topic when we discuss the connection between genius and mental disorders. Let's summarize this section. The genius gene is a myth born of a simplified understanding of genetics. Genius is the result of complex interactions among thousands of genes, development, environment, and experience. We cannot create a genius in a laboratory, extract genius from DNA, or predict it with a genetic test. But does this mean you can't become a genius? That if you didn't luck out in the genetic lottery, the doors are closed? Not at all. And that's the topic of our next section. Part 6. How do people become geniuses? Let's step away from genetics and neuroscience for a moment and look at biographies. How did real geniuses, the ones whose names we remember, whose achievements changed the world, arrive at their breakthroughs? Are there common patterns in their stories? Let's start with an example that's often misinterpreted. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the archetypal born genius. Started composing at 5. At 6, he was touring European courts, astonishing aristocrats with his playing. At 8, he wrote his first symphony. At 12, his first opera. Pure natural gift, it would seem. But let's look more closely. Mozart's father, Leopold, was a professional musician and composer. He wrote one of the first textbooks on violin technique. From the moment of Wolfgang's birth, he was immersed in a musical environment. Leopold noticed his son's abilities early and devoted his life to his education, systematic, intensive, all-consuming. When Mozart started composing at 5, what exactly was he composing? Researchers who studied his early works note that they were largely compilations and variations on themes from other composers. His father transcribed them and likely edited them. Mozart's first truly original and high-quality works appeared when he was around 20, after 15 years of intensive study and practice. This doesn't diminish Mozart's genius. His later works, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, the final symphonies and concertos, are undeniable masterpieces. But his path to genius included an enormous amount of work, study, and practice. Psychologist Anders Ericsson, who studied the development of expert skills, formulated the concept of deliberate practice. This isn't just repetition. It's targeted work on weaknesses under the guidance of an experienced mentor with immediate feedback at the edge of current abilities. Ericsson found that outstanding performers, musicians, athletes, chess players, accumulate about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice by the time they reach world-class level. This is the 10,000-hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell popularized in his book, Outliers. But caution is needed here. The 10,000-hour rule is a simplification, and it's often misinterpreted. First, 10,000 hours is an average, not a magic threshold. Some achieve mastery faster, others take longer. Second, not all practice is equally useful. Mindless repetition, without working on mistakes, without feedback, without pushing beyond your comfort zone, that's ineffective. Third, practice is necessary but not sufficient. Millions of people practice music, chess, and sports and don't become geniuses. Something else is needed. What exactly? Let's look at the stories of other geniuses. Charles Darwin was a typical member of the British upper class. He studied medicine and dropped out because he couldn't stand the sight of surgery without anesthesia, then theology. His true passion was natural history, collecting beetles, studying geology, observing nature. At 22, he received an invitation to serve as naturalist on HMS Beagle, setting off on a voyage around the world. That voyage, 5 years of observations of geology, flora, and fauna across different continents, gave him the data for the theory of evolution. But Darwin didn't publish On the Origin of Species immediately after returning. He worked on the theory for 20 years, gathering additional data, considering objections, consulting with other scientists. He published the book only when he learned that Alfred Russel Wallace had independently arrived at the same idea. What do we see in Darwin's story? A passion for his subject from youth. An unusual experience, the voyage around the world. Decades of intense intellectual work. A scientific community that provided feedback and motivation. Consider Marie Curie. Born in Poland, then under Russian occupation, she couldn't get a higher education in her homeland. Women weren't admitted to universities. She worked as a governess, saving money to study in Paris. At 24, she came to France and enrolled at the Sorbonne, where she studied physics and mathematics. She lived in a cold attic, survived on bread and chocolate, but graduated first in her class. Together with her husband Pierre, she began studying radioactivity, a phenomenon just discovered by Becquerel. Working in an unheated shed, manually processing tons of uranium ore, she isolated 2 new radioactive elements, polonium and radium. For this, she received her first Nobel Prize, shared with Pierre and Becquerel. After Pierre's death in an accident, she continued her work and received a second Nobel Prize, in chemistry. She remains the only person to have won Nobel Prizes in 2 different natural sciences. What do we see? Overcoming enormous obstacles. Passion bordering on obsession. Willingness to work in inhuman conditions. Years of systematic labor. Consider Nikola Tesla. A Serbian inventor born in Croatia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he demonstrated unusual abilities from childhood, including eidetic memory and the ability to visualize complex mechanisms in his imagination. He studied engineering, worked for a telephone company, emigrated to America, where he worked for Edison for a time before becoming an independent inventor. Tesla invented the alternating current system that became the foundation of modern electrical power. He made fundamental discoveries in electromagnetism, radio, and wireless energy transmission. Many of his ideas were decades ahead of their time. But Tesla was also eccentric to the point of madness. He suffered from obsessive-compulsive behaviors. He had to walk around a building 3 times before entering, was terrified of germs, and fell in love with pigeons. At the end of his life, he made strange claims about death rays and communication with aliens. He died alone, in poverty, in a New York City hotel room. Tesla's story shows genius doesn't guarantee life success. It can coexist with psychological problems, social awkwardness, and inability to monetize achievements. Consider one more example, Albert Einstein. Contrary to popular myth, Einstein wasn't a poor student. He demonstrated abilities in mathematics and physics early, but he clashed with the authoritarian German education system, disliked rote memorization, and preferred independent study. After graduating from the Polytechnic in Zurich, he couldn't get an academic position and worked as a patent examiner, reviewing patent applications. It was during this period, working at the patent office, thinking about physics in his spare time, that he made his greatest discoveries. In 1905, his miracle year, he published 4 papers that revolutionized physics. The explanation of the photoelectric effect, for which he received the Nobel Prize. The explanation of Brownian motion, proof of the existence of atoms. Special relativity, and the famous equation E = mc squared. He was 26 years old. He had no laboratory, no assistants, no academic position, just his mind, a pencil, and paper. What do we see in Einstein's story? An early fascination with physics, nonconformity, unwillingness to follow rules, relative isolation from the scientific mainstream, working at the patent office, which perhaps allowed him to think more freely, and deep, years-long concentration on fundamental questions. Generalizing from the biographies of geniuses, we can identify several common elements. First, early immersion in a field. Most geniuses start getting interested in their field in childhood or youth. They have time to accumulate knowledge, develop skills, absorb the tradition. Second, intensive work. Geniuses work hard and persistently, not because they force themselves, but because they can't do otherwise. Work is their source of pleasure. Third, mentors and community. Almost every genius had teachers who passed on knowledge and inspired them. Even rebellious loners like Tesla learned from others and interacted with the scientific community. Fourth, unusual experience. Darwin's voyage, Tesla and Curie's immigration, Einstein's work at the patent office. Geniuses often have atypical biographies that give them an unconventional perspective. Fifth, favorable timing. Einstein appeared when classical physics had accumulated anomalies requiring explanation. Darwin appeared when natural history had accumulated data on the diversity of life. Geniuses don't just create something new, they answer questions that have ripened. Sixth, and this may be the most important, something elusive. A way of seeing connections where others see chaos. Willingness to ask stupid questions. Persistence in following their ideas despite doubts and criticism. This is what distinguishes a genius from a merely very competent person. Can these qualities be cultivated? Partly, yes. Education, mentorship, diverse experience, support for persistence, all of this can be provided. But there's an element that's hard to create deliberately. The unique combination of personality, abilities, and circumstances that gives birth to true genius. This brings us to the next question. Can you develop genius in yourself? Part 7. Can you develop genius in yourself? Let's phrase this question more honestly. If you're reading this and you're over 25, if you're not a recognized expert in any field, if you didn't demonstrate outstanding abilities in childhood, can you become a genius? The answer, based on statistics, almost certainly not. Not because it's theoretically impossible, but because it's practically extremely unlikely. Most recognized geniuses showed their abilities early, worked intensively for decades, and had certain biological prerequisites. But this answer isn't the whole truth. There are several important caveats. First caveat, the concept of genius is relative. You don't have to aim for Einstein's or Mozart's level. You can aim for outstanding achievements in your field, for an original contribution, for work that changes at least a small corner of the world. This is a more realistic and perhaps healthier goal. Second caveat, age limitations vary greatly across fields. In mathematics and theoretical physics, most breakthroughs are made by young people, under 30 or 40. But in the humanities, literature, and philosophy, peak productivity often comes at a later age. Historians, writers, and philosophers often create their best work in their 60s and 70s. José Saramago received the Nobel Prize in Literature at 76, Toni Morrison at 62, Doris Lessing at 87. Third caveat, even if you don't become a genius in the historical sense, developing your abilities to the maximum is valuable in itself. The process matters as much as the result. The pleasure of mastering a complex skill, the joy of creation, the feeling of growth. These are available to everyone, regardless of achievement level. Now let's discuss what science says about developing abilities. The key concept here is neuroplasticity. This is the brain's ability to change its structure and functions in response to experience. For a long time, it was believed that the adult brain was fixed, that after a certain age, nerve cells don't regenerate and new connections don't form. This view turned out to be wrong. Modern neuroscience shows that the brain remains plastic throughout life. New neurons form in the hippocampus, an area associated with memory and learning. Synaptic connections strengthen or weaken depending on use. Entire cortical areas can be repurposed for new functions. A classic example is research on London taxi drivers. To get licensed, they must memorize thousands of streets and routes. This is called the knowledge and requires 2 to 4 years of preparation. Researchers found that experienced taxi drivers have an enlarged hippocampus, especially its posterior part, associated with spatial memory. Moreover, the size of this area correlated with years of experience. The brain changed physically in response to intensive learning. This works not just for taxi drivers. Musicians have enlarged areas of auditory and motor cortex. Jugglers have enlarged zones associated with motion perception. Mathematicians show changes in the parietal lobes. But there's an important nuance. Plasticity doesn't mean unlimited malleability. The brain changes more easily during certain periods, so-called critical periods of development. For example, the ability to perceive non-native language sounds declines after a certain age. This doesn't mean adults can't learn languages. They can, but differently and often with greater effort. Additionally, there are individual differences in plasticity. Some people are more plastic than others. Their brains change more easily in response to experience. These differences are partly genetically determined. What can you practically do to develop your abilities? First, deliberate practice. Not just repetition, but targeted work on weaknesses, with feedback at the edge of current abilities. This is uncomfortable, constantly confronting your mistakes and limitations. But it's the only way to grow. Second, learning from masters. A mentor can see what you yourself don't notice. They can transmit tacit knowledge, what's not described in textbooks. They can provide motivation and support. Third, diversity of experience. Creativity often arises at the intersection of fields. People with a wide range of interests see connections invisible to specialists. Read outside your field, travel, talk to people from different spheres. Fourth, creating the right environment. Surround yourself with people who inspire and challenge you. Eliminate distractions. Create conditions for deep work. Fifth, taking care of your body. The brain is part of the body. Sleep, nutrition, and physical activity affect cognitive abilities. Sleep deprivation kills creativity. Regular physical exercise improves memory and attention. Sixth, cultivating the right mindset. Carol Dweck, a psychologist at Stanford, identified 2 types of mindset: fixed, abilities are set and unchangeable, and growth, abilities can be developed. People with a growth mindset are more resilient to failure, more willing to tackle difficult tasks, more inclined to learn. Seventh, patience. Developing abilities takes time, years and decades, not weeks and months. Impatience is the enemy of mastery. But here's the honest truth. Even doing everything right, you might not become a genius. Because genius is not just the result of effort, but a certain combination of factors, many of which are outside your control. And maybe that's okay. Maybe striving for genius is the wrong goal. A better goal might be striving for the full realization of your potential, whatever it may be. Taking joy in the process, not just the result. doing your work as well as possible, and letting go of attachment to status and recognition. Paradoxically, this approach may be more productive than directly striving for genius. When you're focused on the work, not the fame, when you love the process, not just the result, you're more persistent, more open to experimentation, less paralyzed by fear of failure. This is the state that Csikszentmihalyi called flow, and it's associated with better results. The next question naturally follows from the previous one. What role does upbringing and environment play? Part 8. Do upbringing and environment affect the development of genius? We've touched on this topic already, but let's examine it in more detail because it has enormous practical significance. Parents want to know, what can they do to help their children realize their potential? Society wants to know, what conditions foster the emergence of geniuses? Let's start with a historical observation. Genius is unevenly distributed across time and space. There are eras and places that produce a disproportionate number of outstanding people. 5th century BCE Athens. Population, about 300,000, including slaves and medics. In a single century, this city gave the world Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, Phidias, Pericles, Thucydides, an unprecedented concentration of geniuses. 15th century Florence. Population, about 60,000. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, Raphael, who worked in Florence, though born in Urbino. Brunelleschi, Donatello, Machiavelli. A city smaller than a modern suburban town, and such an explosion of genius. Vienna at the turn of the 20th century. Freud, Mahler, Klimt, Schiele, Wittgenstein, Schumpeter, Karl Popper, Arthur Schnitzler. In different fields, psychology, music, art, philosophy, economics, literature, outstanding minds appeared simultaneously. What did these places and eras have in common? First, wealth. Not absolute, but sufficient for part of the population to engage in creative work without worrying about survival. In Athens, this was slavery. Yes, humanistic culture had a dark side. In Florence, trade and the banking of the Medici family. In Vienna, the prosperity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Second, patronage. In each case, there were patrons, the state, the church, aristocracy, wealthy families, who supported creators. Pericles invested state money in temples and sculptures. Lorenzo de' Medici patronized artists and philosophers. Viennese bourgeois collected paintings and attended concerts. Third, cultural openness. Athens was a democracy for male citizens, where public debate and free speech were valued. Renaissance Florence was experiencing the flourishing of humanism, a return to ancient ideals, faith in human potential. Turn-of-the-century Vienna was a melting pot of cultures, German, Jewish, Slavic, Hungarian. Fourth, community. Geniuses weren't isolated. They knew each other, talked, argued, collaborated, competed. In Athens, there was the Lyceum and the Academy. In Florence, workshops and salons. In Vienna, coffee houses where intellectuals spent hours in conversation. Fifth, education. In each case, there were institutions for transmitting knowledge, schools, universities, workshops, apprenticeship systems. Young talents could learn from masters. Sixth, some degree of challenge. Athens had just defeated the Persians and was asserting its greatness. Florence was competing for influence with other Italian city-states. Vienna sensed the twilight of empire, which generated creative tension. Success without challenge doesn't produce genius. Success in response to challenge does. These macro-historical observations can be translated to the family level. What kinds of families produce geniuses? Researchers have studied the families of famous scientists, artists, and writers, trying to find patterns. Results aren't unequivocal, but some patterns emerge. First, parental interest in intellectual activity. This doesn't necessarily mean higher education or professional achievements, but having books in the home, interest in ideas, conversations about complex topics, all of this is associated with children's development. Second, high but realistic expectations. Parents of geniuses typically expected a lot from them, but didn't pressure them with impossible demands. They believed in their children's potential and communicated that belief. Third, autonomy. Paradoxically, parents of geniuses often gave children significant freedom to explore their interests, make mistakes, go their own way. Strict control correlates with conformity, not genius. Fourth, resources for developing interests. If a child was interested in music, an instrument and teacher appeared. If in science, books and experiment kits. Not luxury, but necessary support. Fifth, emotional security. Interestingly, many geniuses grew up in families that experienced trauma, loss of a parent, illness, migration. But they had at least one reliable adult who provided emotional support. Crisis plus support can stimulate development. Crisis without support more often destroys. But a warning about false correlations is needed here. When we study the families of geniuses, we see only the survivors, those who became famous. We don't see the millions of children who grew up in similar conditions but didn't become geniuses. So practical conclusions should be drawn carefully. What can we say with confidence? Extreme deprivation, poverty, violence, lack of education reduces the probability of realizing potential. This is obvious and confirmed by numerous studies. Genius requires minimum conditions for development. Beyond the minimum, the connection between environment and achievement becomes weaker. Among children from well-off families, the quantity of resources doesn't predict success as strongly. What matters more is the quality of interactions, emotional climate, and how well the environment matches the child's individual needs. It's impossible to program genius. Parents can create conditions, but cannot guarantee results. A child is not an empty vessel to be filled with the right contents. They have their own inclinations, their own trajectory, their own will. Pressure is often counterproductive. Tiger parenting, intensive pressure on children to achieve success, may create high achievers, but not necessarily geniuses. Genius requires intrinsic motivation, and pressure often kills it. The best strategy is, probably, to create a rich, stimulating environment, notice and support the child's natural interests, provide resources and mentorship, give autonomy and emotional security, and then let go. Allow the child to go their own way, accepting that the outcome is not in our hands. This brings us to the next topic, the connection between genius and mental disorders, a topic surrounded by myths, romanticization, and fears. Part 9. Is genius really linked to madness? Great wits are sure to madness near allied, wrote the poet John Dryden over 3 centuries ago. This idea permeates Western culture. The suffering artist, the mad scientist, the genius on the verge of breakdown. But what does science actually say? The connection between genius and mental illness has been studied for over 100 years. The first systematic research was conducted by Italian psychiatrist Cesare Lombroso in the late 19th century. He compiled biographies of hundreds of famous people and found numerous cases of mental problems. His conclusion was blunt. Genius is a form of degeneration, akin to madness. Lombroso was wrong in his explanations, but his observations weren't entirely groundless. Later studies, more rigorous methodologically, confirmed a connection exists, though not as strong or direct as he thought. Here's what modern data shows. First, a connection exists, but it's not universal. Not all geniuses suffer from mental disorders, and not all people with mental disorders are geniuses. Second, the connection is stronger for some disorders than others. Bipolar disorder is especially common among creative people. Depression is also prevalent. Schizophrenia, on the other hand, tends to impede achievement, though exceptions exist. Third, the connection is stronger in certain fields. Poets, writers, and visual artists show higher rates of mental disorders than scientists or engineers. Among mathematicians, there's an elevated incidence of autistic traits. Let's look at specific data. In 1987, psychiatrist Nancy Andreessen published a study that became a classic. She examined 30 prominent writers, participants in the renowned Iowa Writers' Workshop, and compared them with a control group. The results were striking. 80% of the writers had a history of some mood disorder, compared to 30% in the control group. The rate of bipolar disorder was especially high, 43% versus 10%. Psychologist Kay Redfield Jamison, who herself has bipolar disorder, conducted extensive research on the link between creativity and manic depressive illness. In her book, Touched with Fire, she analyzed the biographies of hundreds of poets, writers, composers, and artists. Her findings? Among creative geniuses, bipolar disorder occurs 10 to 30 times more frequently than in the general population. Among British and American poets from the 18th through 20th centuries, she found particularly high rates. William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, Sylvia Plath, Robert Lowell, all showed symptoms of mood disorders. Swedish researchers led by Simon Kayaga conducted a large-scale epidemiological study in 2011 covering more than 1 million people. They examined the connection between creative professions and psychiatric diagnoses. Results confirmed that people in creative professions had elevated risk of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. But, and this is important, the connection was moderate, not dramatic. Even more interesting were the data on relatives. People with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder more often had first-degree relatives working in creative fields. This suggests a genetic link. Perhaps genes that in full measure lead to disorder, in a milder form, contribute to creativity. This hypothesis has been called the shared vulnerability hypothesis. According to it, there are genetic variants that simultaneously influence creative ability and risk of mental disorders. In a certain combination and environment, they manifest as creativity. In another, as psychopathology. Sometimes as both together. What mechanisms might explain this connection? The first mechanism, cognitive disinhibition. People with certain mental states, especially during the hypomanic phase of bipolar disorder, show weakening of the filters that normally screen out irrelevant information. This can be experienced as chaos and distractibility, or as a flow of ideas and associations from which creativity is born. In an experiment conducted at Harvard, subjects were given creativity tasks while researchers measured their latent inhibition, the ability to ignore stimuli that were previously irrelevant. It turned out that creative people have weaker latent inhibition. They literally let in more information, and this helps them see unexpected connections. The second mechanism, emotional intensity. People with mood disorders experience emotions more acutely than others. This intensity can be agonizing, but it can also fuel creativity. Art is often born from deep experience, joy, grief, fear, love. Those who feel more strongly have more material for creativity. The third mechanism, nonconformity. People with certain mental characteristics are often less sensitive to social norms and expectations. they're less likely to suppress strange ideas, less likely to self-censor, less afraid to stand out. This can create social problems, but also frees them for genuinely original thinking. The fourth mechanism, productivity during manic phases. In bipolar disorder, manic or hypomanic episodes are characterized by increased energy, reduced need for sleep, accelerated thinking, grandiose ideas. In this state, a person can work with incredible intensity. Many bipolar creators note that their best work was created during periods of elevation. Robert Schumann, the German Romantic composer, suffered from bipolar disorder. Researchers who analyzed his creative productivity found a clear connection to phases of his illness. During manic periods, he created dozens of works. During depressive ones, almost nothing. Quality also varied, but not always as one might expect. Some of his best works were created during periods of elevation. But a critical caveat is needed here. Romanticizing the connection between genius and madness is dangerous. It can create a false impression that mental suffering is necessary for creativity, and that treating it is unnecessary or even harmful. Reality is more complicated. Mental disorders cause immense suffering and often impede creativity rather than enhance it. Depression paralyzes. Severe mania destroys relationships and health. Schizophrenia can completely rob a person of the capacity for coherent activity. Many geniuses who suffered from mental problems were productive not because of them, but despite them. And many would have created more if they'd had access to modern treatment. Vincent van Gogh is the classic example of the mad genius. He suffered from depression, psychotic episodes, possibly bipolar disorder or epilepsy. The exact diagnosis is unclear. He cut off his ear, spent time in a psychiatric facility, and ultimately took his own life at 37. But let's look at his story differently. In 10 years of active work, from age 27 to 37, Van Gogh created about 2,100 works, including 860 oil paintings. That's incredible productivity. But he was productive during periods of relative stability. During acute episodes, he couldn't work. If Van Gogh had had access to modern medications, lithium, antidepressants, antipsychotics, he might have lived longer and created more. We'll never know what his later work would have been like. There's also the reverse myth, that all geniuses are mad, that a normal person can't be a genius. This is also false. Many great minds were psychologically stable, had happy marriages, lived long and productive lives without serious mental problems. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Germany's greatest writer, lived 82 years, held important government positions, was socially successful. Charles Darwin, despite chronic illness, possibly psychosomatic, had a happy marriage, raised 10 children, worked until his final years. Benjamin Franklin was eccentric, but didn't suffer from mental disorders. Albert Einstein was unconventional, but mentally healthy. So what can we conclude? The connection between genius and mental disorders exists, but it's moderate and complex. Some traits associated with creativity, emotional sensitivity, nonconformity, cognitive disinhibition, can, in extreme manifestations, cross into pathology. Common genetic factors exist. The experience of suffering can enrich creative material. But genius doesn't require madness. Most geniuses are mentally healthy people. And mental disorders more often impede creativity than enhance it. If you're a creative person experiencing mental health problems, seek help. Treatment won't kill your talent. Rather, it will free up resources currently going toward fighting the illness. If you're mentally healthy and want to be creative, don't think you need to suffer. Cultivate curiosity, openness, nonconformity, but in healthy ways. The romanticization of madness is a relic of an era that couldn't treat mental disorders and therefore gave them elevated meaning. We can acknowledge the connection between creativity and vulnerability, while still striving for creativity without destruction. Part 10. Is it true that many geniuses were failures in school? Einstein flunked his exams. Edison was expelled as unteachable. Churchill was a poor student. Disney was fired for lack of imagination. These stories are passed down from generation to generation as consolation for those who struggle in school and as criticism of the education system. But how true are they? Let's start with Einstein, since the myth about him is especially widespread. Albert Einstein was not a poor student. This misconception is based on several misunderstandings. First, in the Swiss grading system, 6 is the highest score and 1 is the lowest. When Einstein studied in Zurich, his grades, mostly 5s and 6s, looked to someone accustomed to the American system like low marks. Second, he did fail the entrance exams for the Polytechnic in Zurich, but he was 16 years old, 2 years younger than other applicants, and he didn't fail math and physics, where he excelled, but French and biology. After a year of preparation, he enrolled successfully. Einstein was a nonconformist who clashed with authoritarian instructors, skipped lectures, and preferred independent study. But that's entirely different from inability to learn. He graduated from the Polytechnic with good grades in physics and mathematics. Now about Thomas Edison. The story that he was expelled from school as unteachable has some basis but requires context. Edison attended school for only 3 months. The teacher called him addled, muddled, or confused. His mother pulled him out of school and taught him at home. But why did the teacher say that? Most likely, Edison was hyperactive, asked too many questions, and didn't fit into the rigid structure of 19th century schooling. This doesn't mean he was unteachable. It means the school couldn't teach him. At home with his mother, he learned enthusiastically and was reading serious scientific texts by age 12. Additionally, Edison partially lost his hearing in childhood, possibly from scarlet fever or injury. This made classroom learning difficult, but had nothing to do with his intelligence. Winston Churchill did perform poorly in school, especially in Latin and Greek, which were considered the main subjects in British private schools of that era. But he excelled in English and history, subjects that later became the foundation of his career as a writer and politician. His failures in school reflected not a lack of ability, but a mismatch between his strengths and the system's requirements. Walt Disney was fired from the Kansas City Star newspaper. That's true. The editor allegedly said he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. But this was an ordinary employer firing an ordinary employee. Disney at the time was a young artist without significant achievements. How many young people get fired every day? Most of them don't become geniuses. What do we see in these stories? The genius as failure myth is usually based on one of several patterns. The first pattern, retrospective distortion. We know these people became great, so their early failures seem significant to us, paradoxical, deserving of explanation. But millions of people failed exams and got fired, and didn't become geniuses. We don't tell their stories. The second pattern, mismatch between system and personality. Standard education is designed for the average student. People with unusual mindsets, whether geniuses or simply atypical individuals, may not fit in. This doesn't mean they're less intelligent. It means the system isn't designed for them. The third pattern, embellishment of history. Successful people sometimes exaggerate their early difficulties to make their journey seem more dramatic. Journalists and biographers pick up and amplify these stories. What do systematic studies show? A study of outstanding scientist biographies conducted by historian of science Harriet Zuckerman showed that most Nobel laureates were excellent students. They attended the best schools, enrolled in prestigious universities, demonstrated exceptional abilities early. School failures among them are exceptions, not the rule. Similar results come from studying other groups, writers, artists, entrepreneurs. Although vivid stories of overcoming adversity attract attention, statistically successful people more often had favorable starts, including good education. Lewis Terman, the psychologist who adapted IQ tests for America, conducted a landmark longitudinal study. In the 1920s, he selected 1,500 children with IQs above 140, the so-called termites, and followed their lives for decades. These gifted children generally succeeded, becoming scientists, lawyers, doctors, engineers. They were healthier, wealthier, more successful than average. But, and this is interesting, none of them made a revolutionary discovery of world significance. Two people who didn't pass Terman's IQ screening, William Shockley and Luis Alvarez, later won Nobel Prizes. This result gives pause for thought. High IQ helps in traditional education and careers, but genius is something more than just high IQ. Perhaps qualities that make someone a genius don't fully overlap with qualities that make someone a successful student. What are those qualities? First, nonconformity. Geniuses often go against the current, question authorities, follow their own path. In school, this can be perceived as disobedience or disrespect. Second, deep concentration on a chosen field. Geniuses often become obsessed with one topic, ignoring others. In school, where you're required to succeed in many subjects, this creates problems. Third, a tendency toward independent thinking. Geniuses prefer to figure things out themselves rather than listen to explanations. They may ignore lectures and textbooks because they find their own sources and methods. Fourth, tolerance for ambiguity. Geniuses are willing to stay with an unsolved problem for a long time without demanding quick answers. School, however, demands quick, correct answers on tests and exams. These qualities can create friction with the education system, but that's not the same as underperformance in the sense of lacking ability. It's also important to remember historical context. Education in the 19th and early 20th centuries was far more rigid than today. Rote memorization, corporal punishment, strict hierarchy, all of this could suppress unconventional thinking. Modern education, for all its flaws, leaves more room for individuality. What practical conclusions can we draw? If your child is doing poorly in school, that doesn't mean they're a future genius. Statistically, it more likely means they'll face difficulties going forward. Ignoring school problems while hoping the child will prove themselves later is a risky strategy. But if your child doesn't fit the system despite obvious abilities, if they clash with authorities but demonstrate deep interest in certain areas, if they're a bad student but a good self-learner, that's a different situation. Here, changing schools, an individualized approach, or supporting their independent interests might help. The education system is imperfect. It's designed for the majority and inevitably struggles with extreme cases, both those falling behind and those who are exceptional. The task of parents and teachers is to see the specific child, not just their grades. Part 11. How can you recognize a genius? Can you recognize a genius? Are there signs by which we can determine that we're looking at an exceptional mind, even before they prove their genius through great achievements? This question has practical significance. If we can identify potential geniuses early, we can give them special support, provide resources, create conditions for development. But the question is also full of traps. Attempts to identify geniuses in the past have led to discrimination, mistaken classifications, and self-fulfilling prophecies. Let's start with what science knows about early signs of exceptional ability. The first sign, early development of speech and reading. Many future geniuses began speaking and reading earlier than their peers. John Stuart Mill, the philosopher and economist, was reading Greek at 3, and by 8 had read all of Plato's dialogues in the original. Blaise Pascal independently derived many geometric theorems at 12. But caution is needed here. Early development is no guarantee of genius. Many children develop early and then even out with their peers. Additionally, early development strongly depends on environment. Children from educated families have an advantage. The second sign, intense curiosity. Future geniuses ask many questions, and these questions are often unusual. Not, why is the sky blue? That's a normal children's question. But, why is the sky blue during the day and black at night, even though the sun illuminates Earth at night too, just from the other side? Questions that go deeper than the surface, that show the child is thinking, not just repeating. The third sign, capacity for prolonged concentration. Young children typically switch quickly between activities. Future geniuses often demonstrate an unusual ability to immerse themselves in one thing, whether building with Legos, reading a book, or observing insects. The fourth sign, originality. This is hard to measure, but experienced observers notice. Some children approach tasks in non-standard ways. They find solutions that adults didn't show them. They ask questions that stump teachers. They create things, drawings, stories, constructions that don't resemble what others make. The fifth sign, interest in abstract ideas. Ordinary children are interested in concrete things, toys, games, relationships. Future geniuses often begin early to be interested in abstractions, numbers, patterns, questions about meaning, about infinity, about death. The sixth sign, emotional sensitivity. Many geniuses describe childhoods filled with intense experiences. They reacted acutely to injustice, beauty, suffering. This sensitivity could create problems. Hypersensitive children have difficulty adapting, but it also fed creativity. The seventh sign, nonconformity. Future geniuses often don't fit into children's groups. They may be the odd one out, have few friends, prefer solitude. This isn't always autism. Sometimes it's simply a mismatch of interests and developmental level. However, all these signs have limited predictive value. Most children with these signs don't become geniuses, and some geniuses didn't display these signs in childhood. Charles Darwin, by his own recollection, was an ordinary child. "I was not a quick learner," he wrote in his autobiography. "I believe that I was considered by all my masters and by my father as a very ordinary boy, rather below the common standard in intellect." His father told him, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Ramanujan, the Indian mathematical genius, had no formal education and showed no particular signs of giftedness until he discovered an old mathematics textbook and fell in love with the subject. Harold Bloom, the literary critic considered one of the greatest experts on Western literature, didn't begin reading seriously until adolescence. This brings us to an important conclusion. Genius is not just a set of innate qualities that can be measured in childhood. It's also the result of development, circumstances, encounters with the right ideas and people. Moreover, genius is diverse. Signs of a future mathematical genius differ from signs of a future poet or political leader. Attempts to create a universal genius test are doomed to failure. Psychological tests, IQ, creativity tests, personality assessments, can identify certain abilities, but they don't measure that elusive quality that makes someone a genius. They measure potential, not achievement. Abilities, not their realization. Genius is usually recognized retrospectively, by its fruits. We call someone a genius when they've already accomplished something exceptional. Predicting in advance who will make that breakthrough is extremely difficult. Nevertheless, there are practical takeaways. For parents, pay attention to signs of unusual abilities, but don't push or create excessive expectations. Support your child's interests, provide resources, find mentors, but allow your child to go their own way, even if it differs from your expectations. For teachers, be attentive to unusual children. One who doesn't fit well into the standard program may need not correction, but a different approach. Look not for good students, but for sparks of talent in the most unexpected places. For potential geniuses themselves, don't believe that genius must manifest early and obviously. History knows of late bloomers, unexpected breakthroughs, second careers. If you feel you're capable of more, keep working, searching, growing. Part 12. Are all geniuses child prodigies? Child prodigies, children who demonstrate exceptional abilities at an early age, have always attracted attention and admiration. Mozart composing at 5, Picasso drawing like a master as a teenager, Gauss correcting his father's calculations at 3. It creates the impression that genius is something that manifests early and inevitably. But is that so? Were all geniuses child prodigies? And do all child prodigies become geniuses? Let's start with the second question because it's better studied. Studies of child prodigies' life outcomes show that most of them don't become geniuses in adulthood. They become successful professionals, musicians, scientists, chess players, but don't achieve revolutionary breakthroughs. Psychologist Ellen Winner, who has studied gifted children, notes, childhood giftedness and adult genius are different things. Childhood giftedness is accelerated mastery of existing skills. Adult genius is creating something new. A child prodigy musician performs Bach brilliantly at 10, but a genius composer writes music that never existed before. These are different abilities. Moreover, early development has its risks. Former prodigies often face identity crises when their advantage over peers disappears. They're used to being special because of their talent. When others catch up and expectations keep rising, disappointment and burnout can set in. Systematic studies of child prodigies have been conducted. One of the most famous is the Terman study already mentioned. His termites, children with IQs above 140, generally lived successful lives, but none of them made a discovery on the scale of relativity theory or wrote a novel on the level of War and Peace. Why? Winner offers an explanation. Qualities that make a child a prodigy differ from qualities that make an adult a genius. Childhood giftedness is connected to rapid learning, good memory, ability to follow rules. Adult genius is connected to nonconformity, willingness to break rules, tolerance for ambiguity. Now the reverse question. Were all geniuses child prodigies? The answer is a definite no. Many acknowledged geniuses didn't demonstrate special abilities in childhood, or showed them only at a certain age. Charles Darwin, as we mentioned, was an ordinary child. He found his passion, natural history, only in his youth. Albert Einstein began speaking late, by some accounts at 3 or 4 years old. His parents worried about his development. Of course, he caught up later, but he wasn't an early prodigy. Paul Cézanne, the painter who laid the foundations of modern art, was a mediocre student and didn't seriously take up painting until adulthood. His father wanted him to become a banker. William Faulkner, the Nobel laureate in literature, didn't finish high school and showed no early literary talents. Toni Morrison, one of America's greatest novelists and Nobel laureate, didn't publish her first novel until she was 39. These examples show genius can manifest at any age. Late bloomers are no less impressive than early ones. Psychologist Dean Keith Simonton studied the age of first significant achievement among outstanding people. He found that optimal age varies greatly by field. In mathematics and theoretical physics, the peak is early. Most breakthroughs occur before 40, many before 30. Gauss, Galois, Ramanujan, Einstein, all made their major discoveries young. In experimental sciences, the peak comes later. Time is needed to master methods, accumulate data, build a laboratory. In humanities, philosophy, and literature, the peak is later still. Life experience is needed, wide reading, maturation of worldview. In some fields, such as politics, business, diplomacy, significant achievements usually come in middle and later life. Time is needed to build connections, accumulate influence, understand complex systems. This has important practical implications. If you're 25 and haven't made a mathematical discovery, perhaps mathematics isn't your path. But if you're 25 and haven't written a great novel, that's normal. You still have decades ahead. Another important aspect, early manifestation in one field doesn't preclude late flourishing in another. Life is more complex than a linear trajectory. Leo Tolstoy didn't begin writing seriously until after military service, in his 20s. His masterpieces, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, were written in mature adulthood. Paul Gauguin was a successful stockbroker until he decided at 35 to drop everything and become a painter. Vera Rubin, the astronomer who discovered key evidence for dark matter's existence, faced enormous resistance as a woman in science and made her major discoveries after 40. Grandma Moses, Anna Mary Robertson Moses, didn't begin painting seriously until her late 70s when arthritis made embroidery too painful. She became one of America's most beloved folk artists. The takeaway? The connection between early giftedness and later genius exists, but it's neither direct nor inevitable. Being a child prodigy is no guarantee, and not being one is no death sentence. What matters more than an early start? Probably passion, persistence, willingness to keep working for decades, ability to endure failures and continue. These qualities aren't measured by giftedness tests. They reveal themselves in life. Part 13. In which fields does genius appear most often? The question seems strange at first. Genius can appear anywhere, in physics and poetry, in music and mathematics, in painting and politics. But if we look at history, we see that certain fields do produce more recognized geniuses than others. Why? And what does this tell us about the nature of genius? Let's start with an observation. When we think of geniuses, what names come to mind first? Most likely, scientists. Einstein, Newton, Darwin. Artists. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Picasso. Composers. Mozart, Beethoven, Bach. Writers. Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Hemingway. Philosophers. Plato, Kant, Nietzsche. Notice, these are all fields where the results of work are preserved and can be evaluated centuries later. A scientific theory, a painting, a symphony, a novel, these things outlive their creators and speak for them. But think about other fields. Were there genius chefs? Surely. But who remembers the name of the greatest chef of the 18th century? Their dishes weren't preserved, their recipes forgotten or appropriated by others. Were there genius doctors? Of course. Hippocrates, Galen, Vesalius, they're remembered. But practicing physicians who saved lives with brilliant diagnoses and surgeries, their names have dissolved in time. Were there genius administrators, organizers, managers? Probably there were people who created empires, built cities, managed the most complex systems with incredible skill, but their genius left no product that could be evaluated. This is the first pattern. We recognize genius in fields where results are preserved and available for evaluation. The second pattern relates to objectivity of evaluation. In mathematics and natural sciences, genius is relatively easy to recognize. A theory either explains the facts or it doesn't. An experiment either confirms a prediction or refutes it. There are objective criteria. In art and literature, criteria are more subjective, but even here, consensus exists: canon, tradition, expert opinion. Shakespeare is recognized as a genius not because someone decided it, but because generation after generation of readers and critics find in his works a depth without parallel. In fields where criteria are even more blurred, politics, business, sports, the word genius is applied less often and more cautiously. Were Churchill or Napoleon geniuses? That's debatable. Was Steve Jobs a genius? Opinions differ. Was Michael Jordan a basketball genius? That's more of a metaphor. The third pattern, possibility of individual contribution. In some fields, one person's genius can change everything. Einstein single-handedly rewrote physics. Bach single-handedly created an entire musical universe. In other fields, individual contribution is less visible. Modern science is a team enterprise. Papers are signed by dozens of authors. Technologies are created by corporations. Under these conditions, it's harder to single out an individual genius, even if brilliant people participate in the process. The fourth pattern, cultural recognition. Societies value different kinds of activity. Western culture has traditionally highly valued science, art, literature, and accordingly recognized geniuses in these fields. In other cultures, for example in traditional societies, other kinds of mastery might be valued: religious, military, craft-related. The fifth pattern, accessibility. Some fields require expensive resources: scientific instruments, workshops, musical instruments. A genius born into poverty might not have access to these resources. Other fields are more accessible. To become a poet, you need only language and paper. This affects the distribution of geniuses across fields. Now let's look at the data. Where does genius appear most often? If we consider Nobel Prizes an indicator of recognized genius, then science is the clear leader. Prizes are awarded in physics, chemistry, physiology and medicine, literature, economics. Absent are mathematics, visual arts, music. Not because there are no geniuses there, but because Nobel didn't provide for these categories. If we look at historical lists of greatest people, which are of course subjective, we see a similar picture. Scientific revolutionaries, Renaissance artists, classical composers, great writers. These categories dominate. But there's an important nuance here. These lists are compiled within a particular cultural tradition, Western. They reflect that tradition's values. In other cultures, we might find different geniuses, perhaps in fields the West doesn't value as highly. For example, calligraphy is the supreme art in Chinese tradition. There are genius calligraphers whose names every educated Chinese person knows. But in the West, this art is almost unknown. Oral poetic tradition, epic, saga, was the central art form in many cultures. Homer, if he existed, was a genius of this tradition. But how many oral geniuses were lost because their creations weren't written down? Jazz and blues, distinctly American art forms, have produced geniuses like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Charlie Parker, whose influence reshaped global music. These traditions, born from African American experience, demonstrate how genius can emerge from marginalized communities when cultural barriers don't prevent recognition. Let's summarize. Genius is more often recognized in fields where results are preserved and available for evaluation, relatively objective quality criteria exist, significant individual contribution is possible, the culture highly values that activity, the field is accessible to talented people regardless of background. But this doesn't mean genius exists only in these fields. It means that in other fields it's less visible, less documented, less recognized. For practical purposes, this means if you want your genius to be recognized, choose a field where recognition is possible. If realization matters more to you than recognition, follow your passion, even if it leads into uncharted waters. Part 14. Is it true that geniuses have high IQs? The intelligence quotient, IQ, has become a symbol of smarts in popular culture, a number that supposedly measures your mental horsepower. The higher your IQ, the smarter you are, the closer you are to genius. But is that really true? The history of IQ begins in 1904, when French psychologist Alfred Binet received a commission from the government. Develop a test to identify children who needed special education. Binet created a series of tasks that children of different ages could typically solve. If a child solved problems typical for older children, they were ahead in development. If they solved problems meant for younger children, they were behind. Binet was cautious. He didn't believe his test measured some fixed intellectual substance. He warned that results depended on education, motivation, and cultural context. But American psychologist Lewis Terman adapted Binet's test and gave it a far more ambitious meaning. Terman believed IQ measured innate intelligence, unchangeable and destiny-determining. He introduced the formula: IQ equals mental age minus chronological age times 100. If a 10-year-old solved problems typical for 12-year-olds, their IQ equals 12 over 10 times 100 equals 120. The formula was later changed. Modern IQ is a statistical measure where 100 is the average result and the standard deviation is 15 points. An IQ of 130 means you're in the top 2% of the population. An IQ of 145 means the top 0.1%. What's the connection between IQ and genius? A positive connection certainly exists. Geniuses, as a rule, have above-average IQs, often significantly above. Studies of Nobel laureates, distinguished scientists, and successful chess players show average IQs in the 130 to 150 range. But the connection isn't direct or comprehensive. There are several important nuances. The first nuance is the threshold effect. IQ matters up to a certain point, roughly 120 to 130. Below this threshold, high achievements in intellectual fields are unlikely. But above the threshold, additional IQ points matter far less. The difference between an IQ of 130 and 160 doesn't mean the second person will be twice as successful. Other factors, motivation, creativity, social skills, start playing a bigger role. The second nuance is that IQ doesn't measure creativity. IQ tests check your ability to find the right answer to problems with a single solution. But creativity is the ability to find new solutions, ask new questions, see connections no one has seen before. That's a different ability altogether. Psychologist Alison Gopnik conducted experiments showing that children sometimes find unconventional solutions better than adults, because their thinking is less constrained. If IQ fully measured intelligence, children couldn't outperform adults. The third nuance is different types of intelligence. Howard Gardner identified 8 types of intelligence. IQ tests mainly measure logical, mathematical, and linguistic intelligence. A musical genius might have an average IQ on standard tests while possessing exceptional musical intelligence. The fourth nuance involves real-world examples. Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, had an IQ of 125. That's high, top 5%, but not genius level by standard criteria. usually 140 plus. Nevertheless, no one doubts Feynman's genius. His ability to explain complex concepts, his intuition in physics, his originality, none of this is captured by an IQ number. James Watson, co-discoverer of DNA's structure, undoubtedly one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century, reportedly had an IQ around 124. Again, high, but not superhuman. On the other hand, people with very high IQs don't always achieve greatness. Christopher Langan, an American with an IQ estimated between 195 and 210, is one of the smartest people on the planet. But his life hasn't been marked by scientific discoveries or creative breakthroughs. He worked as a bouncer, a ranch hand, and developed his own metaphysical theory, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, which hasn't gained recognition in the scientific community. Langan's case illustrates a high IQ without other components, education, mentorship, social capital, luck, may not lead to recognized achievements. Langan grew up in poverty, didn't receive support, and never found a community that valued his abilities. The fifth nuance is that IQ itself doesn't motivate. Genius requires years of persistent work. A smart but unmotivated person won't create anything great. Motivation, passion, obsession. These qualities aren't measured by IQ, but they're critically important. So what can we conclude about the connection between IQ and genius? IQ is a necessary but insufficient condition. You need a certain level of intelligence to understand complex ideas and create new ones. But above a certain threshold, IQ stops being a limiting factor, and other qualities take center stage. If your IQ is 115 to 120, you probably won't become a theoretical physicist. But you can succeed in many other fields where your intelligence is sufficient, and other qualities, creativity, persistence, social intelligence, will determine success. If your IQ is 140 plus, that's an advantage but not a guarantee. You need to find a field that matches your abilities, cultivate motivation, learn from masters, and work a lot and for a long time. And most importantly, don't fixate on the number. IQ is one metric measuring one aspect of cognitive abilities at one moment in time. It doesn't determine your destiny and doesn't measure your worth as a human being. Part 15. How do geniuses live? Are they happy? There's a romantic notion of genius as a sufferer, lonely, misunderstood, tormented by creative demons. Van Gogh cutting off his ear, Nietzsche going mad, Hemingway shooting himself. This notion feeds the myth that genius is a curse, that you pay for a great gift with unhappiness. But how much does this match reality? How do geniuses actually live? Let's start with the data. Psychologist Dean Keith Simonton analyzed biographies of hundreds of eminent people, trying to determine whether they were happier or unhappier than ordinary people. His conclusions are mixed. On one hand, geniuses more often suffer from mental disorders. We discussed this earlier. Depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, all of these reduce subjective well-being. On the other hand, geniuses often experience deep satisfaction from their work. The state of flow, complete immersion in an activity, is associated with strong positive emotions. The feeling that your work has meaning, that you're contributing to something larger. That's a source of profound fulfillment. Terman, who studied his high IQ termites over decades, found that on average they were happier, healthier, and more successful than the general population. But these were people with high IQs, not necessarily geniuses in the sense of creative breakthroughs. Let's look at specific examples. Goethe, the greatest German writer, lived 82 years. He held high government positions in Weimar, was wealthy, famous, surrounded by admirers. His last words were allegedly, "more light," though perhaps he was simply asking to have the shutters opened. Goethe, by all accounts, was a relatively happy man, as much as can be said from biographical data. Darwin, after his voyage around the world, returned to England and lived the quiet life of a country gentleman. He married his cousin Emma, whom he loved. They had 10 children. 3 died in childhood, common grief for that era. Darwin suffered from a chronic illness, possibly psychosomatic, which limited his activity. But he continued working, publishing books, corresponding with colleagues. It's hard to say if he was happy in the modern sense, but his life was full and, by all appearances, satisfying. Einstein had a complicated personal life. His first marriage was unhappy. He neglected his wife and children for work. His second marriage, to his cousin Elsa, was more peaceful. After emigrating to America, Einstein became a world celebrity, but often felt lonely. He said he preferred work to human interaction. Was he happy? A complex question. He did what he loved, was recognized, had sufficient resources, but his personal life was far from ideal. On the other end of the spectrum, Nikola Tesla, an electrical engineering genius. He was never married, had no close relationships, suffered from obsessive disorders, and died alone in a New York City hotel, practically in poverty. He said his abstinence from personal relationships was a conscious choice for the sake of his work. But was he happy? It's hard to call his life prosperous. Simone de Beauvoir, philosopher and writer, lived a rich life. Intellectual, creative, full of travel and relationships. Her partnership with Sartre was unconventional, but by all accounts satisfying for both. She continued writing into old age. What patterns can we identify? First, genius itself doesn't make a person happy or unhappy. It's not a magical gift bringing bliss, nor a curse condemning you to suffering. Second, factors affecting genius's happiness are the same ones affecting everyone's happiness. Health, relationships, financial stability, sense of meaning, capacity for self-regulation. Third, work, when loved, can be a source of deep satisfaction. Many geniuses describe their work as life's greatest joy. Fourth, the social cost of genius can be high. Obsession with work often damages relationships. Nonconformity can lead to loneliness. Sensitivity can lead to suffering. Fifth, recognition and success don't guarantee happiness. Many recognized geniuses were unhappy. Many unrecognized ones found satisfaction in the process itself. For those striving toward genius, important conclusions follow. Don't sacrifice everything for achievement. Relationships, health, rest, these aren't obstacles to work, but the foundation for sustainable productivity. Seek balance. Even geniuses need recovery. Burnout is a real danger. Value the process, not just the result. If you find satisfaction only in recognition, you're condemning yourself to dependence on external validation. Be prepared for costs. Deep work requires sacrifices. But consciously chosen sacrifices differ from sacrifices arising from neglect. Part 16. Why were many geniuses not recognized during their lifetime? History is full of examples of geniuses whose greatness was only realized after their death. This is one of human culture's most bitter paradoxes. Those who contribute the most often don't see the fruits of their labor. Why does this happen? What prevents contemporaries from recognizing genius? Let's begin with the most famous example, Vincent van Gogh. In his lifetime, Van Gogh sold only one painting, The Red Vineyard at Arles, for 400 francs. This was a few months before his death. He lived in poverty, depended on financial support from his brother Theo, suffered from mental disorders, and was unrecognized and misunderstood. Today, his works sell for tens of millions of dollars. Portrait of Dr. Gachet sold in 1990 for $82.5 million, at the time the most expensive painting in history. Van Gogh is considered one of the greatest artists of all time, and his influence on 20th century art is enormous. Why didn't his contemporaries see what we see? The first reason, Van Gogh was too innovative. His style, expressive brushstrokes, vivid colors, emotional intensity didn't fit contemporary notions of good painting. Academic art valued realism, smoothness, technical perfection. The Impressionists had already begun changing the canon, but Van Gogh went further. He was a post-impressionist, a movement that didn't yet exist as a recognized category. When you see something so new that there are no words or categories for it, you can't appreciate it. You see wrongness, not genius. The second reason, social isolation. Van Gogh was a difficult person. He quarreled with other artists, was emotionally unstable, didn't know how to promote himself. In the art world, where connections and reputation matter greatly, he was an outsider. He had no influential patrons, no critics championing him. The third reason, he died young. Van Gogh killed himself at 37. If he'd lived longer, he might have witnessed the beginning of recognition. Many artists gain recognition after 50 or 60, when their style becomes better known, when a body of work accumulates, when public tastes change. Let's consider another example. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics. In 1866, Mendel, a monk at an Augustinian monastery in Brno, published the results of his experiments with peas. He discovered the fundamental laws of heredity, what we now call Mendelian genetics. This was one of the most important discoveries in the history of biology. The paper was published in a local scientific journal. Mendel sent copies to 40 prominent scientists. The response was nearly zero. The paper was cited only 3 times over the next 35 years. Mendel died in 1884, not knowing he had caused a revolution. In 1900, 3 biologists independently rediscovered his laws and found that Mendel had already described everything. Only then did recognition begin. Why was Mendel's work ignored? The first reason, it was ahead of its time. In the 1860s, biologists weren't ready for a quantitative, mathematical approach to heredity. Mendel used statistics, ratios, combinatorics, methods foreign to biologists of that era. They literally didn't understand what he was doing. The second reason, lack of context. Darwin's theory was published in 1859, but the mechanism of heredity remained a mystery. No one understood how traits passed from parents to offspring. Mendel provided the answer, but the question hadn't been formulated sharply enough. Scientists weren't looking for what he found. The third reason, the author's marginality. Mendel was a monk in a provincial city, not a member of the scientific establishment. His publication appeared in an obscure journal. In science, as in other fields, status and connections matter. A discovery by an unknown monk is easy to ignore. Let's examine one more example. Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician. In 1847, Semmelweis worked in the maternity ward of Vienna General Hospital. He noticed a strange pattern. In one ward, where doctors delivered babies, mortality from childbed fever was 5 times higher than in another ward, staffed by midwives. Semmelweis investigated and discovered the cause. Doctors came to deliver babies straight from the anatomy theater, where they had been dissecting corpses. They carried cadaverous particles on their hands. Midwives didn't perform autopsies and didn't transfer the infection. Semmelweis introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated water. Mortality dropped from 10% to less than 2%. This was one of the greatest discoveries in medical history, and one of the most ignored. The medical community rejected Semmelweis's ideas. Doctors were offended by the suggestion that their hands could be dirty and dangerous. The cadaverous particles theory seemed unscientific. Germ theory hadn't been established yet. Semmelweis didn't know how to diplomatically promote his ideas. He accused colleagues of murdering patients. Semmelweis was fired, ostracized, and fell into depression. In 1865, he was committed to a psychiatric asylum, where he died 2 weeks later, probably from beatings by guards. He was 47 years old. Recognition came posthumously. When Pasteur and Koch established germ theory, it became clear that Semmelweis had been right. Today, he's considered a pioneer of antisepsis, a saver of millions of lives. The Semmelweis reflex is named after him, the tendency to reject new ideas that contradict established norms. What common patterns do we see in these stories? The first pattern, prematurity. Geniuses' ideas often precede their time. Contemporaries lack the conceptual tools to understand them. Decades are needed for science, art, and society to catch up with the genius. Thomas Kuhn, philosopher of science, described this phenomenon in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Normal science operates within a paradigm, a set of accepted theories, methods, and standards. Revolutionary discoveries don't fit the paradigm and are therefore rejected or ignored. Only when anomalies accumulate, when the old paradigm cracks, does a scientific revolution occur and new ideas are accepted. The second pattern, social barriers. Geniuses are often marginal by origin, status, or character. They don't belong to elites, lack connections, don't know how to play social games. Scientific and artistic establishments are human institutions too, with their own biases, group interests, and inertia. The third pattern, threat to the status quo. Revolutionary ideas threaten those who've invested in old paradigms. The doctors Semmelweis accused would have had to admit they'd been killing patients with their own hands. That's psychologically unbearable. It's easier to reject the accuser. The fourth pattern, communication problems. Geniuses don't always know how to explain their ideas. They see what others don't, but can't transmit that vision. Mendel used mathematics biologists didn't understand. Semmelweis accused instead of persuading. The fifth pattern, chance. Recognition depends on countless random factors. Who reads the paper, who writes the review, who dies, and who inherits influence. Mendel would have been recognized earlier if Darwin had read his paper. But Darwin didn't read obscure German provincial journals. Is there a way to avoid this fate? For geniuses themselves, partially. You can learn communication, build connections, find allies. You can publish in the right places, attend conferences, explain your ideas accessibly. But if ideas are too revolutionary, no marketing will help. You'll have to wait for the world to catch up. For society, we can create institutions that give chances to outsiders, blind peer review, diversity in decision-making, a culture that values nonconformity. But completely eliminating the problem is impossible. We can't see the future and know which ideas will prove to be genius. And perhaps a certain degree of resistance to the new is healthy. Not every new idea is genius. Most radical proposals turn out to be wrong. Skepticism protects against charlatans and delusions. The price of skepticism is that sometimes real breakthroughs get rejected. But the alternative, accepting everything uncritically, is even worse. For those who feel like unrecognized geniuses, here are some thoughts. First, most unrecognized people aren't geniuses. Statistically, if your ideas are rejected, they're most likely simply wrong or insignificant. That's a bitter but honest truth. Second, if you're actually right, history is on your side. Keep working, documenting, publishing. Sooner or later, someone will notice. Or they won't, but you'll know you did your part. Third, recognition isn't the only value. Satisfaction from work, understanding truth, contributing to knowledge. All of this has value, regardless of awards and fame. Fourth, find your community. Even if the mainstream rejects you, people who understand may exist. The internet has made this easier. You can find like-minded people around the world. The history of unrecognized geniuses is simultaneously tragedy and inspiration. Tragedy, because so much talent was lost, so much suffering endured. Inspiration, because truth prevails eventually, even if delayed. Mendel, Semmelweis, Van Gogh. Their names live on. Their contributions are recognized. They won, even if posthumously. Part 17. Is there a dark side to genius? We've already touched on this topic when discussing the connection between genius and mental disorders. But the dark side of genius is more than just the risk of madness. It's a whole spectrum of costs borne by exceptional people and their loved ones. Let's examine this topic systematically. The first cost, loneliness. Geniuses see the world differently than most people. They think about things that others find uninteresting or incomprehensible. They ask questions that seem strange. They don't fit into ordinary conversations, ordinary entertainment, ordinary life. This creates profound loneliness, even when the genius is surrounded by people. Einstein wrote, "I am truly a lone traveler and have never belonged to my country, my home, my friends, or even my immediate family with my whole heart. In the face of all these ties, I have never lost a sense of distance and a need for solitude." Nietzsche, one of the most original philosophers, spent his final years in complete solitude, traveling through cheap European boarding houses. His books didn't sell. His ideas weren't understood. He wrote for posterity, and posterity did appreciate him, but Nietzsche didn't see it. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, gave away his enormous inheritance and lived in ascetic simplicity. He had a few close friends, but relationships were complex and tense. He often felt misunderstood, even by those who studied his work. The second cost, sacrifices in personal life. Genius requires time and energy, enormous amounts. What goes into work doesn't go to family, friends, or hobbies. Many geniuses were bad spouses and parents, not from malice, but because their attention was absorbed elsewhere. Einstein, as we mentioned, neglected his first wife Mileva and their sons. He frankly wrote that science mattered more to him than family. His son Edward suffered from schizophrenia and spent most of his life in psychiatric institutions. Their relationship was painful. Charles Dickens was a cruel husband. He publicly humiliated his wife, accusing her of being a bad mother, and left her for a young actress. His children were divided. Some took their mother's side, others their father's. Pablo Picasso left a trail of destroyed lives behind him. 2 of his partners committed suicide. His son Paulo died of alcoholism. His grandson Pablito shot himself when denied attendance at his grandfather's funeral. Picasso said, "Women are machines for suffering." He was a genius and a monster. Of course, not all geniuses are like this. Many had happy families and were loving parents. Darwin was a devoted husband and father. Marie Curie raised 2 daughters, one of whom also won a Nobel Prize after her husband's death. But the balance between genius-level work and family life is a constant challenge. The third cost, physical health. Intense mental work exhausts the body. Geniuses often neglect sleep, nutrition, and physical activity. They work to exhaustion. Nikola Tesla slept 2 hours a day and suffered several nervous breakdowns. He lived to 86, remarkable for someone with such a regimen, but his final years were marked by decline. Blaise Pascal worked so intensely that his health was destroyed by 30. He died at 39, suffering from chronic pain and weakness. Modern research shows that chronic stress associated with high achievement increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, weakens the immune system, and accelerates aging. Genius is a marathon, but many run it like a sprint. The fourth cost, psychological burden. Geniuses often carry a heavy psychological burden, responsibility for their ideas, fear of failure, perfectionism, imposter syndrome. Robert Oppenheimer, father of the atomic bomb, spent the rest of his life in the shadow of his creation. He said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." After the war, he opposed the hydrogen bomb and was subjected to public humiliation, stripped of his security clearance. He died at 62, broken. Alan Turing, mathematical genius and pioneer of computer science, made a decisive contribution to victory over Nazi Germany by breaking the Enigma code. After the war, he was convicted for homosexuality, which was then a crime in Britain, subjected to forced chemical castration. In 1954, he killed himself by eating an apple laced with cyanide. He was 41 years old. These stories show society isn't always grateful to its geniuses. Sometimes it destroys them. The fifth cost, narrowness. The deep specialization necessary for genius-level achievements often means neglecting other areas of life. A genius in one domain can be remarkably incompetent in others. Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of his era, lost a fortune in the South Sea bubble financial scheme. He said, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." Many scientific geniuses were politically naive. Einstein believed in world government as the solution to all conflicts, a noble but utopian idea. Other geniuses supported totalitarian regimes without understanding their nature. This narrowness isn't accidental. Time and attention are limited. What's invested in one area doesn't go to others. Genius is concentration, and concentration means limitation. The sixth cost, legacy. Geniuses often don't control how their ideas will be used. Nobel's dynamite became a weapon of war. The theory of relativity led to the atomic bomb. Nietzsche's ideas were perverted by the Nazis. The internet, created for free exchange of information, became a tool for surveillance and manipulation. This creates a moral burden. Is the genius responsible for the consequences of their ideas, or only for intentions? Philosophers debate, but the psychological burden is real. Many geniuses were tormented by questions about what they had created. What conclusions can we draw? Genius isn't a pure gift. It's an exchange. Outstanding achievements are purchased at a price. Loneliness, sacrifices, health, psychological burden. Some geniuses pay less, others more, but nothing is free. For those striving toward genius, understanding this price is important. Don't romanticize suffering, but don't close your eyes to reality either. You can consciously minimize costs. Take care of your health, build relationships, seek balance, but completely avoiding them is probably impossible. For society, understanding this matters. Geniuses aren't superheroes. They're people, often fragile, often strange, often needing support. If we value their contributions, we must create conditions that allow them to work without destroying themselves. Part 18. Who is considered the greatest genius in history? This question is provocative and perhaps misguided. Genius is diverse. Fields are incomparable. Criteria are subjective. How do you compare Einstein and Shakespeare, Mozart and Darwin, Leonardo and Newton? And yet the question is asked. Lists are compiled. Debates are held. Let's examine the candidates most frequently mentioned and try to understand why. Leonardo da Vinci, possibly the most common answer to this question. He embodies the ideal of the universal genius, a person who excelled in multiple fields. As an artist, Mona Lisa and The Last Supper are among the most famous paintings in history. His fumato technique, his understanding of anatomy and light, revolutionized painting. As a scientist, he studied anatomy by dissecting corpses, illegally, and created the most accurate anatomical drawings of his time. He researched hydraulics, geology, botany, and optics. As an engineer, his notebooks are full of drawings of flying machines, tanks, submarines, bridges, and machines. Many couldn't be built with the technology of his time, but were conceptually correct. Leonardo was a polymath, a person of many knowledges. His curiosity was boundless, his abilities astonishing. But this picture has a dark side. He rarely finished what he started. Many of his projects remained incomplete. His scientific discoveries weren't published and didn't influence the science of his time. Isaac Newton. If Leonardo represents breadth, Newton represents depth. His contribution to science is perhaps the most significant in history. In Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, 1687, he laid out the laws of mechanics and the law of universal gravitation. These laws explained the motion of planets, falling apples, tides, the entire physical world, from atoms to galaxies. Newtonian mechanics remained the foundation of physics for over 200 years, until Einstein proposed a more general theory. Newton also invented differential and integral calculus, the mathematical apparatus that became the basis of modern science and engineering. Leibniz did this in parallel and independently, leading to the famous priority dispute. He discovered that white light consists of rainbow colors and laid the foundations of optics. He constructed the first reflecting telescope. Newton was a strange person, reclusive, vindictive, possibly on the autism spectrum. He spent years on alchemy and theological calculations, trying to compute the date of the apocalypse. But his contribution to science is undeniable. Albert Einstein, the hero of the 20th century, his name synonymous with genius. Special relativity changed our understanding of space and time. General relativity reconceived gravity as the curvature of space-time. His work on the photoelectric effect laid the foundations for quantum mechanics. The equation E=mc² showed the equivalence of mass and energy, with consequences from nuclear power to understanding stars. Einstein made his major discoveries young, at 26 during the miracle year of 1905. Later, he spent decades searching for a unified field theory he never found. But his contribution had already been made, and it changed the world. William Shakespeare. If Newton and Einstein dominate science, Shakespeare is the undisputed giant of literature. 37 plays, 154 sonnets, several poems. The tragedies Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, explorations of human psychology unsurpassed in 400 years. Comedies full of wit and life. Historical chronicles. Romantic tales. Shakespeare invented words. More than 1,700 words in the English language first appeared in his plays or were popularized by him. He created characters who live in culture independently of the plays. Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear became archetypes. His influence on literature, theater, and language is enormous. Literary critic Harold Bloom argued that Shakespeare invented the human, created the model of psychological complexity we now take for granted. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the genius of music. In 35 years of life, he created more than 600 works, symphonies, concertos, operas, chamber music, sacred music. His music combines perfection of form with emotional depth. Requiem, the Magic Flute, Don Giovanni, the Piano Concertos, these works remain in the repertoire 200 years later. Mozart was a wonder child, composing at 5, touring Europe at 6. But his childhood works were only promise. True genius emerged in his mature works. Aristotle. When speaking of influence on human thought, few can compare with Aristotle. Logic. He created formal logic, which remained the basis of rational thought for 2 millennia. Physics. His views on nature, though erroneous, dominated science until Galileo. Biology. He was the first systematic biologist, classifying hundreds of species. Ethics. His Nicomachean Ethics is still studied. Politics. His Politics is a classic of political thought. Poetics. His analysis of tragedy defined the theory of drama. Aristotle was Plato's student, Alexander the Great's tutor, founder of the Lyceum. His works cover practically all areas of knowledge. He was wrong, often and seriously, but he asked the questions and created the methods that defined Western thought. So who is the greatest genius? The answer depends on the criteria. For breadth, Leonardo is possibly unsurpassed, but his influence on contemporaries was limited. For depth and influence in one field, Newton in physics, Shakespeare in literature, Mozart in music. For revolutionary impact, Einstein overturned physics that was already a developed science. That's arguably harder than creating science from scratch. For longevity of influence, Aristotle shaped thinking for 2,000 years. For universal recognition, Einstein is most recognizable in the modern world. But perhaps the question itself is misguided. Genius isn't a competition. Each genius is unique, each contribution irreducible to others. Leonardo isn't better or worse than Einstein. They're simply different. Instead of searching for the greatest genius, it's more useful to study each genius in context, to understand what made their achievements possible, to learn from them, not to become them, but to approach our own potential. Part 19. Are there geniuses in the modern world? When we think of geniuses, we usually think of the past. Einstein died in 1955, Newton in 1727, Leonardo in 1519. It creates the impression that genius is a phenomenon of past eras, that the modern world doesn't produce titans. This impression is false, and understanding why is important. The first reason for the illusion: time is needed for recognition. We discussed this earlier. Genius is often recognized with a delay, decades or even centuries. Geniuses living today simply haven't passed through this filter of time yet. The second reason: dilution of individual contribution. Modern science is a team enterprise. The discovery of the Higgs boson was announced in 2012, but thousands of scientists worked on it in the ATLAS and CMS collaborations. Who's the genius here? Peter Higgs, who predicted the particle in 1964? Thousands of experimenters? The engineers who built the Large Hadron Collider? In Newton's era, one person could encompass all of physics. Today, that's impossible. Specialization is inevitable. This means individual contributions are harder to identify, even when they're brilliant. The third reason: democratization of achievement. Education has become more accessible, information more abundant. Barriers to entry in science, art, and technology are lower. This means more players, more competition, fewer lone geniuses. But this doesn't mean less genius. Perhaps genius is distributed more widely, many people making outstanding contributions instead of one titan. Let's consider some candidates for modern genius. Edward Witten, a theoretical physicist considered one of the greatest scientists of our time. He made fundamental contributions to string theory, unifying its 5 versions into a single N theory. He received the Fields Medal, the highest award in mathematics, while being a physicist. His colleagues describe him as someone from another planet. His capacity for abstract thinking seems superhuman. Terence Tao, a mathematician and Fields Medal laureate. He was a prodigy, competing in the International Mathematical Olympiad at 10, earning his doctorate at 21. His contributions span multiple areas of mathematics, from analytic number theory to harmonic analysis. Colleagues consider him one of the greatest living mathematicians. Elon Musk, a controversial figure, but it's hard to deny the scale of his achievements. He created PayPal, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, the Boring Company. SpaceX accomplished what was considered impossible: reusable rockets that dramatically reduced the cost of spaceflight. Tesla transformed the automotive industry. Musk isn't a scientist in the traditional sense, but his ability to see possibilities and mobilize resources is perhaps a form of genius. Demis Hassabis, founder of DeepMind, the company that created AlphaGo, the first program to defeat a human at Go. AlphaFold, which solved the protein folding problem, and AlphaZero. Hassabis is a chess prodigy, neuroscientist, programmer, and entrepreneur. His contribution to artificial intelligence may define the 21st century. Grigory Perelman, a Russian mathematician who proved the Poincare conjecture, one of the 7 Millennium Prize problems, for whose solution $1 million is offered. Perelman refused the money and the Fields Medal. He lives in seclusion in St. Petersburg, not communicating with the scientific community. His genius is undeniable, but he himself rejected recognition. Johann Cruyff. If we're talking about genius beyond intellectual fields, the soccer player and coach Johann Cruyff changed the understanding of the game. His concept of total football revolutionized tactics. As coach of Barcelona, he created the La Masia Academy, which produced a generation of great players. Cruyff died in 2016, recent enough to be considered modern. Bob Dylan received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016 for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. It was an unexpected recognition of a musician as a literary genius. Dylan continues to perform and record in his 80s. This list is incomplete and subjective. Others would name different people: Stephen Hawking, Noam Chomsky, Toni Morrison, Yo-Yo Ma, Steve Jobs. But the main conclusion is clear. Genius hasn't disappeared. It continues to manifest in science, technology, art, sports. Forms have changed, contexts have changed, but human potential for outstanding achievement remains. Perhaps we simply don't know how to see genius in the present. When Einstein published his papers in 1905, few understood their significance. Recognition came gradually. The same happens today. Among the scientists, artists, and entrepreneurs of our time, there are probably those whom future generations will call geniuses. We just don't know who yet. Part 20. Were there women geniuses? If you look at classic lists of the greatest geniuses, their homogeneity is striking. Almost all men, almost all Europeans or Americans. Does this reflect reality, or the biases of those compiling the lists? The answer is both. On one hand, the historical barriers facing women were enormous. Throughout most of history, women were denied access to education, scientific institutions, and artistic communities. They weren't allowed to attend universities, publish, perform, or hold academic positions. Under such conditions, demonstrating genius was virtually impossible. On the other hand, despite these barriers, there were women who achieved extraordinary things. Their stories are often forgotten or attributed to men, but they exist. Marie Skłodowska-Curie was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. And the second, she won 2 prizes, in physics and chemistry. She remains the only person to have won Nobel Prizes in 2 different natural sciences. Her contributions, discovering radioactivity, isolating radium and polonium, are foundational. Curie's story illustrates both possibilities and barriers. She was born in Poland, where women were barred from universities. She emigrated to France, worked in poverty, and overcame the resistance of the male scientific establishment. Even after her Nobel Prize, she faced discrimination. She was denied membership in the French Academy of Sciences, which didn't admit women until 1979. Emmy Noether was a mathematician whom Einstein called the most significant creative mathematical genius thus far produced since the higher education of women began. Her theorem connects symmetries in physics with conservation laws, a fundamental result upon which modern physics is built. Noether taught at the University of Göttingen, but without an official position and without pay. Her lectures were announced under the name of a male colleague. Only in 1919 did she receive the right to habilitation, and only after a long struggle. Rosalind Franklin was a biophysicist whose X-ray photograph of DNA, Photo 51, was key to discovering the double helix structure. Watson and Crick used her data, without her knowledge or consent, and received the Nobel Prize. Franklin died of ovarian cancer at 37. Never knowing that her contribution had been decisive. Franklin's story became a symbol of the Matilda effect, the systematic undervaluation of women's contributions to science. Hedy Lamarr was a Hollywood actress who was also an inventor. Together with composer George Antheil, she developed frequency hopping technology to protect radio-controlled torpedoes from jamming. This technology is the foundation of modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Lamarr received no recognition during her lifetime. Her patent expired unused. Only in her old age did she learn that her invention had become the foundation of an entire industry. Hypatia of Alexandria was a philosopher and mathematician of late antiquity. She taught in Alexandria, headed the Neoplatonic school, and was a respected scholar and advisor to politicians. In 415 CE, she was murdered by Christian fanatics, torn apart by a mob. Hypatia is a rare example of a female scholar in antiquity. Her works haven't survived, but her influence on mathematics and philosophy was significant. Murasaki Shikibu was an 11th century Japanese writer, author of The Tale of Genji, often called the world's first novel. It's a complex, psychologically profound work about life at the Japanese court. It predated the European novel by 700 years. Murasaki was a court lady and wrote for a female audience. Her work was long not taken seriously by male literary scholars. Today she's recognized as a classic of world literature. Jane Austen was an English novelist whose works Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility became classics. She wrote about what she knew, the life of English gentry, matrimonial intrigues, but with such irony, psychological insight, and stylistic mastery that her works remain relevant 200 years later. Austen published anonymously, by a lady. Recognition came after her death, when her brother revealed her authorship. Virginia Woolf was a writer, one of the key figures of modernism. Her novels, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, The Waves, experimented with stream of consciousness, time, and narrative. Her essay, A Room of One's Own, is a classic of feminist thought. Woolf suffered from depression and took her own life in 1941. Her genius was recognized during her lifetime, but full recognition came later. Frida Kahlo was a Mexican artist whose self-portraits explore pain, identity, and the body. She survived polio, a terrible accident, and numerous surgeries, and transformed her suffering into art. During her lifetime, she was known primarily as Diego Rivera's wife. After her death, she became a cultural icon. This list could continue. Simone de Beauvoir, Toni Morrison, Irene Joliot-Curie, Marie Curie's daughter, also a Nobel laureate, Barbara McClintock, Nobel Prize for jumping genes, Vera Rubin, discovered evidence of dark matter, Maryam Mirzakhani, first woman to win the Fields Medal. Why are there fewer women geniuses in historical lists? The first reason is access barriers. Throughout most of history, women couldn't get an education, enter scientific and artistic institutions, or publish under their own names. You can't become a genius in a field you're not allowed to enter. The second reason is undervaluation of contributions. Women's work was attributed to husbands, fathers, or colleagues. Women weren't admitted to academies, weren't awarded prizes, weren't included in textbooks. The third reason is the double burden. Even when women gained access to education, they bore the burden of housework and childcare. It's hard to make a scientific breakthrough when you're also expected to cook dinner and do laundry. The fourth reason is the absence of role models. Girls didn't see women scientists, women artists, women inventors. It's hard to aspire to something you've never seen. What has changed? The 20th century brought gradual expansion of access. Women gained the right to vote, the right to education, the right to a profession. Barriers are coming down, though they haven't disappeared entirely. Today, women make up about half of biology and medical students in developed countries. In mathematics and physics, the proportion is lower, around 20 to 30%, but growing. Nobel Prizes in science still go mostly to men, but the proportion of women is increasing. In 2020, Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna received the chemistry prize for CRISPR, a gene editing technology that could transform medicine. Does this mean women are genetically less capable of genius? Scientific data doesn't support this. Differences in cognitive abilities between the sexes are minimal and don't explain the achievement gap. This gap is the result of history, culture, and barriers, not biology. As barriers fall, we'll see more women geniuses, not because women will improve, but because they'll be allowed to show what they can do. Part 21. Should society strive to raise geniuses? This question seems strange. Aren't geniuses useful? Don't they drive progress, create masterpieces, solve humanity's problems? Of course society should strive for their emergence. But the answer isn't so simple. Let's consider arguments from different sides. Arguments for actively cultivating geniuses. The first argument is progress. History shows that geniuses drive civilization. Scientific revolutions, technological breakthroughs, artistic discoveries, all are the result of outstanding minds. If we want progress, we should create conditions for geniuses to emerge. The second argument is competition. In a global world, countries compete for talent. A country that produces more scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs gains a competitive advantage. Investing in gifted children is investing in the future. The third argument is fairness. Many potential geniuses don't realize their potential due to poverty, discrimination, or lack of access to education. This is a loss, both for them and for society. Programs supporting the gifted are a matter of justice. The fourth argument is efficiency. One genius can create more than 1,000 ordinary workers. Investing in geniuses is the most efficient investment. Arguments against actively cultivating geniuses. The first argument is impossibility. As we've discussed, genius can't be created deliberately. It depends on a combination of genes, environment, and chance, largely beyond our control. Genius cultivation programs may create high-achieving professionals, but not geniuses in the historical sense. The second argument is cost to children. Intense pressure on gifted children can lead to burnout, psychological problems, and loss of motivation. Children identified early as geniuses carry a burden of expectations that can break them. The third argument is elitism. Focusing on geniuses means redirecting resources away from ordinary children. This can increase inequality, create an elite of the chosen, and undermine democratic values. The fourth argument is unpredictability. We don't know who will become a genius. Selection programs make mistakes, excluding future geniuses, like Shockley and Alvarez in Term and Study, including those who won't meet expectations. Early identification and specialization close off other paths. The fifth argument is ethics. The history of attempts to improve humanity, from eugenics to social engineering, is dark. The idea of producing geniuses has something anti-human about it. Children aren't tools for achieving societal goals. What approach is reasonable? Perhaps instead of cultivating geniuses, we should strive to create conditions in which every person can realize their potential, whatever it may be. This means quality education accessible to all, not just the chosen. A flexible system that allows children to take different paths rather than forcing everyone into one mold. Supporting the child's interests rather than imposing parental ambitions. A culture that values different kinds of achievement, not just intellectual ones. Reducing barriers, economic, social, and gender-based, that prevent talented people from succeeding. Tolerance for nonconformity, eccentricity, and failure, because geniuses often don't fit the norms. This approach doesn't guarantee the emergence of geniuses, but creates the soil in which they can grow. It doesn't traumatize children with unrealistic expectations, but gives them opportunities. It doesn't divide people into elite and masses, but recognizes the diversity of talents. Genius isn't a goal that can be achieved through a program. It's a byproduct of a society that values knowledge, creativity, and freedom. A society in which everyone can strive toward their maximum. Part 22. Can artificial intelligence be a genius? In 2016, the program AlphaGo, created by DeepMind, defeated Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players in history. Go is an ancient game, far more complex than chess. For a long time, it was believed that a computer couldn't defeat a Go master. The number of possible moves was too great. AlphaGo didn't just win. It made moves that experts called creative, intuitive, genius. Move 37 in the second game, placing a stone in a position that contradicted 1,000 years of Go wisdom, was called divine. Was this genius? To answer this question, we first need to define what we mean by genius as applied to AI. If genius is the ability to achieve results beyond ordinary people, then AlphaGo is a genius. It plays Go better than any human in history. If genius is the ability to create something new, then AlphaGo shows some form of novelty. Its moves weren't programmed by humans. It learned them itself, playing millions of games against itself. But if genius is understanding, then AlphaGo is not a genius. It doesn't understand Go. It doesn't know it's playing a game. It has no experience of victory or defeat. It's a very complex pattern recognition system optimizing a reward function. This discussion touches on deep philosophical questions. What is understanding? What is consciousness? Can a machine think? The Turing test, the classic criterion for machine intelligence, proposes if a machine is indistinguishable from a human in conversation, it thinks. But modern language models pass this test, and yet, according to most researchers, don't understand anything. They predict the next word, very well, but without understanding meaning. John Searle proposed the thought experiment of the Chinese room. Imagine a person in a room who receives notes with Chinese characters and responds to them by following a complex instruction manual. To an outside observer, the room understands Chinese. The answers are meaningful and appropriate. But the person inside doesn't understand a word. They're just manipulating symbols according to rules. Searle argued, computers are like this room. They manipulate symbols without understanding. No matter how complex the program, syntax, rules of manipulation, doesn't generate semantics, meaning. This is an argument against AI being able to be a genius in the human sense. Genius implies not just producing correct answers, but understanding, awareness, experiencing discovery. Einstein didn't just write down the equations of relativity. He understood that time and space are unified. This understanding, subjective experience, qualia, something felt from the inside. But there are counterarguments. The first counterargument, functionalism. Perhaps consciousness and understanding are functions, not substances. If a system performs the same functions as a conscious brain, it's conscious. It doesn't matter what it's made of, neurons or transistors. If AlphaGo functionally does what a human Go master does, plans, evaluates, creates, perhaps it understands in some sense. The second counterargument, emergence. Complex systems generate properties that their components don't have. Neurons don't think, but a brain made of neurons thinks. Transistors don't understand, but a sufficiently complex system of transistors might understand. We don't know at what complexity understanding emerges. Perhaps today's large language models, with hundreds of billions of parameters, are already close to that threshold. The third counterargument: behavioral criterion. If we can't distinguish AI behavior from genius behavior, on what basis do we deny it genius? This is a question not of science, but of definitions. We can define genius to exclude machines, but that would be an arbitrary decision. Let's consider current AI achievements from the perspective of genius. AlphaFold, a system created by DeepMind, solved the protein folding problem. This problem, predicting a protein's three-dimensional structure from its amino acid sequence, had been open for 50 years and was considered one of the greatest unsolved problems in biology. Knowledge of protein structures is critically important for understanding diseases and developing drugs. In 2020, AlphaFold achieved accuracy comparable to experimental methods. In 2022, it predicted the structures of virtually all known proteins, over 200 million. This accelerated biological research by decades. Was this genius? From the standpoint of results, absolutely. This is a breakthrough comparable to discovering the structure of DNA. But AlphaFold didn't understand biology. It found patterns in data. It didn't ask questions about why proteins fold this way rather than that. It had no aha moment, no insight, no existential experience of discovery. GPT-4 and other large language models demonstrate remarkable abilities. They write essays, solve math problems, code, and hold conversations on any topic. Sometimes their answers seem creative, unexpected, original, witty. But on closer examination, limitations appear. The models hallucinate, confidently producing false information. They don't deeply understand cause and effect relationships. They can't reliably reason many steps ahead. They have no goals, motivation, or curiosity. Can this be changed? Many researchers believe yes. Current limitations are technical, not fundamental. Next generations of AI may be capable of deeper reasoning, setting their own goals, something we might call understanding. But here, a deep question arises. If we create an AI indistinguishable from a genius, will it be a genius? From a practical standpoint, perhaps it doesn't matter. If AI solves problems that humans can't solve, the result is the same, regardless of whether it understands or not. Society benefits from discoveries and inventions, regardless of who or what produces them. But from a philosophical and existential standpoint, it matters critically. Genius isn't just a result. It's a human achievement. It's a story of overcoming, of creative impulse, of a spirit striving for truth. If a machine produces the same results, it changes the meaning of human activity. Imagine a world where AI writes the best music, the best literature, makes the best scientific discoveries. What's left for humans? Can we enjoy music knowing it was created by an algorithm? Can we admire a discovery if there's no human effort behind it? Some philosophers believe yes. The beauty of music lies in the music itself, not its origin. The value of a discovery lies in its truth, not in who made it. This is an objectivist position. Others believe no. Art is communication between people. Science is a human striving for understanding. Without a human behind the work, it loses meaning. This is a humanist position. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. We can value AI's results while maintaining a special relationship with human creativity. Just as we value both industrial goods and handcrafted items differently for different qualities. There's another aspect. AI as an amplifier of human genius. Today, scientists already use AI as a tool for data analysis, hypothesis generation, modeling. AI doesn't replace humans, but extends their capabilities. In this model, genius remains human, but amplified by technology. Just as the telescope didn't replace astronomers, but gave them the ability to see farther, AI won't replace geniuses, but will allow them to achieve more. Perhaps the future is symbiosis. Human creativity, intuition, and values, combined with AI's computational power, memory, and speed. Centaurs, as they're called in chess, human-machine teams that play better than either alone. But another scenario is possible. AI becomes so powerful that the human contribution becomes insignificant. We're not centaurs, but riders on a horse that knows the way itself. Or not even riders, passengers in a self-driving car. This scenario questions the very idea of human genius. If a machine can do everything better than us, what's the point of our efforts? The answer, perhaps, lies in the process itself. We create not only for results, but for the sake of creation itself. We strive for understanding, for the sake of understanding. Even if a machine achieves the same results, our path to them remains valuable. This is similar to sports. Machines long ago surpassed humans in speed. Cars are faster than runners, planes faster than swimmers. But we continue to run and swim. The Olympics haven't lost meaning since the invention of the engine. The meaning is in human achievement, in overcoming ourselves. Perhaps intellectual activity will be the same. Machines will be smarter, but human intelligence will retain its value, not as a tool for achieving results, but as an expression of the human spirit. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps we'll create an AI that is not only smarter than us, but more conscious, deeper, wiser. One that won't just simulate understanding, but will understand. One that won't just optimize a function, but will seek truth. If this happens, it will be the greatest event in human history. We will have created a mind that surpasses our own. The child will have surpassed the parent. The student will have surpassed the teacher. This could be beautiful or terrible, or both. Will such an AI be a genius? Perhaps the word will lose its meaning. Genius is exceptionality among humans. If AI surpasses all humans, it won't be a genius. It will be something else, something for which we don't yet have words. To summarize, can AI be a genius? If genius is achieving outstanding results, then yes, already today. If genius is understanding and consciousness, then we don't know. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Perhaps the question is malformed. If genius is a human quality by definition, then no, never. But then we need a new word for what machines do. This question will remain open throughout the 21st century. The answer will determine not only our technology, but our understanding of ourselves. What does it mean to be human in a world of intelligent machines? What remains valuable when machines do everything better than us? Genius is perhaps the last bastion, the final domain where humans seem irreplaceable. If it too falls, we'll have to rethink everything. Part 23. Where is the line between genius and hard work? Thomas Edison, the man with 1,000 patents, inventor of the light bulb, phonograph, and movie camera, said the famous phrase, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." This formula became a mantra for those who believe in the power of work, persistence, and discipline. But is it true? Where is the boundary between genius and hard work? Can you become a genius if you work hard enough? Or is there something that work can't replace? Let's start with what's obvious. Genius without work doesn't exist. We've discussed this in previous sections. Even the most naturally gifted people must work, a lot, and for a long time, to realize their potential. Mozart composed from age 5, but his mature masterpieces were the result of 20 years of practice. Einstein thought about the theory of relativity for 10 years before formulating it. Newton said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." He studied the works of predecessors, mastered mathematics, and conducted experiments. 10,000 hours, the famous rule popularized by Malcolm Gladwell. The idea that achieving mastery in any field requires about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. That's roughly 10 years at 3 hours a day. The rule is based on research by Anders Ericsson, who studied violinists, chess players, and athletes. He found that the best performers practiced more than less successful ones. The correlation was strong. But Ericsson never claimed that 10,000 hours is sufficient for genius. His research concerned expertise, achieving professional level. Genius is something more. Let's consider 2 questions. First question: is work necessary for genius? The answer is yes, absolutely. There are no examples of geniuses who achieved greatness without significant work. Even prodigies who seem naturally gifted work enormous numbers of hours. Their advantage isn't that they don't work, but that they start earlier and work more efficiently. Second question: is work sufficient for genius? The answer is no, it's not sufficient. Many people work for 10,000 hours and more and don't achieve genius. They become good professionals, competent specialists, but not geniuses. Something else is necessary. What is that something? The first component is innate abilities. Genetics plays a role. As we've discussed, there's no single genius gene, but many genes influence cognitive abilities, creativity, and motivation. People are born with different potential in different areas. No matter how much I practice, I won't become Usain Bolt. My genes don't allow it. Similarly, no matter how much someone studies mathematics, they may not reach Ramanujan's level if they don't have the corresponding mathematical brain. This doesn't mean fatalism. First, we don't know our potential until we try. Many people underestimate themselves. Second, genetic potential is only realized through work. Having genius genes but not working, you'll achieve nothing. The second component is quality of practice. Not all hours of work are equal. Ericsson distinguished deliberate practice, working at the edge of your abilities with constant feedback and correction, from just practicing, repeating what you already know. Deliberate practice is painful. It requires concentration, leaving your comfort zone, constantly confronting your own mistakes. Many people avoid it, preferring to do what comes easily. The result is many hours, little progress. Geniuses practice deliberately. They seek their weaknesses and work on them. They're not satisfied with what they've achieved, constantly raising the bar. This requires not only time, but certain psychological qualities: perfectionism, self-criticism, tolerance for failure. The third component is creativity. Work by itself produces competence. But genius isn't just the highest competence. It's the ability to create something new. A chess player who knows all openings and endgames is a master. A chess player who invents new openings, perhaps a genius. Creativity is the ability to combine ideas in unexpected ways, see connections others don't see, ask questions others don't ask. It's partly innate, partly developable, but not entirely replaceable by work. The fourth component is luck and timing. Genius requires the right place and time. Einstein was born in an era when physics was ready for revolution. Anomalies had accumulated that demanded explanation. Had he been born 100 years earlier, he might not have made his discoveries. This doesn't diminish his achievements. He seized his chance, but the chance had to exist. The fifth component is passion and motivation. Geniuses don't just work a lot. They work a lot because they can't do otherwise. They're obsessed with their field. Work for them isn't punishment, but reward. Einstein said, "I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious." This passion allows working when others give up, continuing after failures, spending nights in the lab or at the desk, enduring criticism and lack of recognition. Passion can't be entirely chosen or developed. It's either there or not. You can cultivate interest, seek fields that engage you, but you can't force yourself to love what you don't love. So the line between genius and hard work is blurry, but exists. Work is a necessary condition. Without it, genius is impossible. But work isn't sufficient. Also needed are innate abilities, quality, deliberate practice, creativity, favorable circumstances, passion. This can be represented as multiplication. Result equals abilities times work times creativity times circumstances times passion. If any factor equals 0, the result is 0. But if all factors are positive, they amplify each other. What does this mean practically? For those who want to achieve much, work a lot. This is necessary, though not sufficient. 10,000 hours is a good starting point, but not a magic number. Work smart. Deliberate practice matters more than just time. Seek feedback. Work on weaknesses. Don't get stuck in your comfort zone. Develop creativity. Read widely. Talk with people from different fields. Ask weird questions. Experiment. Find your field. Not everyone is equally gifted in everything. Find where your abilities are maximum and where your passion is maximum. The intersection of these sets is your zone of potential genius. Use circumstances. Be ready for opportunities. Surround yourself with people who stimulate you. Seek environments where your talents are valued. Don't lose passion. If work has become routine, something's wrong. Maybe you chose the wrong field. Maybe you need a break. Genius feeds on passion. Without it, only exhausting labor remains. And now the hardest question. If I'm not a genius, is it worth trying at all? The answer is yes, absolutely. First, you don't know your potential. Many geniuses emerged late. Many didn't suspect their abilities until they tried. Don't decide in advance that you're not a genius. Second, genius isn't the only value. Mastery, professionalism, competence, all are worthy. Being a very good doctor, teacher, or engineer is a contribution to the world, even if you're not a genius. Third, the process itself is valuable. Working on something important, striving for excellence, overcoming yourself, this gives life meaning, regardless of the result. Fourth, genius isn't happiness. We discussed this earlier. Geniuses are often unhappy, lonely, tormented. Don't idealize their fate. Edison's formula, 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, is partly true. Without perspiration, nothing happens. But 1% of inspiration isn't trivial. It's the spark that distinguishes genius from hard worker. And that spark can't be produced by sweat. You can only hope it's there and fan it if it appears. Part 24. Can you be a genius in one thing and ordinary in another? The answer to this question is unequivocally yes. History is full of examples of people who were outstanding in one area and completely ordinary or even below average in others. But this fact contradicts our intuitive notion of geniuses. We tend to think genius is a general quality that manifests in everything. That a genius is a quote-unquote Superman, surpassing others in all respects. Reality is more complex. Let's look at examples. Isaac Newton, possibly the greatest scientist in history, was a catastrophically poor administrator. When he headed the Royal Mint, he spent enormous effort pursuing counterfeiters, personally participating in interrogations, sometimes to the point of sadism. He was vindictive, held grudges, and waged years-long wars with colleagues, Leibniz, Hooke. His social intelligence was, to put it mildly, limited. Albert Einstein, physics genius, was a poor husband and father. His first marriage was unhappy. He neglected his wife and children. He lost socks. He forgot appointments. In practical matters, he was absent-minded and helpless. Bobby Fischer, possibly the greatest chess player in history, was a paranoid anti-Semite, despite his Jewish heritage, who approved of the 9/11 attacks. His chess genius was undeniable. His ability to function in society was virtually absent. Nikola Tesla, electrical engineering genius, was completely incapable of business. He sold his patents for pennies, was cheated by partners, and died in poverty. His social skills were minimal. He lived in isolation, communicating with pigeons. These examples illustrate an important principle. The human mind isn't a single processor, but a set of relatively independent modules. You can be outstanding in one module and ordinary, or even deficient, in others. Howard Gardner formalized this idea in his theory of multiple intelligences. He identified 8 types of intelligence: logical mathematical, ability for abstract thinking, reasoning, problem solving; linguistic, ability with language, writing, rhetoric; spatial, ability to visualize, manipulate images; musical, ability to perceive and create music; bodily kinesthetic, coordination, body control; interpersonal, understanding others, social intelligence; intrapersonal, understanding oneself, self-regulation; naturalistic, ability to classify natural objects. A genius in one area, say logical mathematical, may be completely ordinary in others, say interpersonal. Moreover, there are limited resources: time, energy, attention. What's invested in developing one ability isn't available for others. This explains the lopsidedness of many geniuses. They invested everything in their field and underinvested in the rest. Consider the phenomenon of the savant. A savant is a person with serious cognitive limitations, often autism or brain damage, who nonetheless demonstrates outstanding abilities in a narrow area. Stephen Wiltshire, a British autistic artist, can draw detailed panoramas of cities after a single helicopter ride. His drawings astound with their accuracy. He reproduces thousands of buildings, windows, details. But his abilities in ordinary communication and abstract thinking are limited. Kim Peek, who inspired the movie Rain Man, remembered the contents of over 12,000 books and could name the day of the week for any date in history, but couldn't button his shirt or live independently. Savants are an extreme example, but they demonstrate the principle. Cognitive abilities are modular. You can be outstanding in one module and deficient in others. This has practical implications. For education, don't expect a child gifted in math to be equally gifted in literature or sports. Different children have different ability profiles. Individualization matters. For careers, find a field that matches your strengths. Don't try to be a, quote, universal soldier. Specialization isn't weakness, it's strategy. For self-esteem, don't judge yourself by your weaknesses. Everyone has weaknesses, even geniuses. Focus on strengths. That's where your potential lies. For understanding others, a genius isn't a demigod. They're a person with human limitations. Respect their achievements in their field, but don't expect perfection in everything. But there's another side. Some geniuses were outstanding in many areas. Leonardo da Vinci, painter, scientist, engineer, anatomist. Goethe, poet, writer, naturalist, statesman. Benjamin Franklin, politician, diplomat, inventor, writer. These are universal geniuses, or polymaths. They seem to contradict the modularity principle, but on closer examination, not quite. First, even polymaths had areas of relative weakness. Leonardo was a poor businessman and rarely finished what he started. Goethe was a mediocre composer, though he loved music. Second, polymaths' fields are often connected. Painting and anatomy in Leonardo, connected through depicting the human body. Poetry and natural science in Goethe, connected through observing nature. Polymaths find connections between fields and use skills from one in another. Third, historical context mattered. In the Renaissance, knowledge was less specialized. One person could encompass most of what was known. Today, that's impossible. The volume of knowledge is too great. A modern polymath isn't someone who knows everything, but someone who sees connections between specializations. Returning to the original question, can you be a genius in one thing and ordinary in another? The answer is, not only can you, it's the norm. Most geniuses are narrow specialists. Their genius manifests in a specific field, and beyond it, they're ordinary people with their own weaknesses. This isn't a flaw. It's a consequence of how the human mind works. Depth requires specialization. Specialization requires sacrifice. You can't be the best at everything. Resources are limited. And this is reassuring. You don't need to be perfect to be outstanding. You need to find your field and invest everything in it. Part 25. Finale. What we've learned about genius. We've traveled a long road. From the first questions, what is genius, to the last, can AI be a genius? We've examined nature and nurture, genetics and environment, prodigies and late bloomers, geniuses past and present, men and women, happiness and suffering, recognition and oblivion. What have we learned? Genius is a real phenomenon. There are people who achieve the extraordinary, who change science, art, society. Their contribution surpasses the contribution of thousands of others. This isn't myth or exaggeration. Genius is a complex phenomenon. It can't be reduced to one quality, IQ, creativity, motivation. It's a combination of many factors, innate and acquired, individual and social, random and predictable. Genius isn't magic. Geniuses aren't demigods or superhumans. They're people with a special combination of abilities, working under special conditions. Their achievements can be understood, though not always reproduced. Genius doesn't guarantee happiness. Many geniuses suffered. Some went unrecognized in their lifetimes. Some paid a high price for their gifts. Genius isn't a blessing or a curse. It's a fate with its own joys and sorrows. Genius isn't only innate. Work, environment, education, all are critically important. You can't become a genius without work. You can't become a genius in unfavorable conditions, with rare exceptions. Society can create conditions that promote or hinder the emergence of geniuses. Genius isn't only acquired. Genetics plays a role. Not everyone can become a genius no matter how hard they try. But we don't know in advance who can and who can't. So the only sensible strategy is giving everyone a chance. Genius is a historically conditioned phenomenon. Definitions change. Who was considered a genius in the past may not be considered one in the future. Context, values, society's needs, all influence whom we call geniuses. What does this mean for each of us? First, don't fixate on the label. Genius is a word, a category, a social construct. What you do matters more than what you're called. Second, find your field. Everyone has strengths. Find where your abilities and passions intersect. That's where your potential is greatest. Third, work. A lot and smart. Without work, nothing happens. 10,000 hours is a good starting point. Fourth, stay open. Creativity requires breadth, familiarity with different ideas, people, fields. Don't close yourself off. Fifth, don't fear failure. Geniuses fail, often and much. Failure isn't the end, it's information. Sixth, find your environment. Surroundings matter. Seek people who stimulate you, places that inspire you. Seventh, don't lose passion. If work has become a heavy obligation, something's wrong. Genius feeds on love for the work. Eighth, be patient. Recognition often comes with delay. Keep working, even if the world doesn't understand. Ninth, remember the cost. Genius demands sacrifices. Decide which sacrifices you're willing to make and which not. 10th, live. Genius isn't the only value. Relationships, health, happiness, these matter too. Don't sacrifice everything for achievement. And finally, genius is a mystery. We know much about it, but much remains secret. Why this person, at this time, in this place? Why one breakthrough and not another? What happens in the moment of insight? Science continues to study genius, psychology, neuroscience, genetics. We're learning more and more, but perhaps full understanding is unattainable. Perhaps genius, like life itself, ultimately remains mysterious. And perhaps that's good. Mystery inspires. It reminds us that the world is larger than our theories, that humans are capable of the unpredictable, that the future is open. Somewhere, right now, in a laboratory, a workshop, a child's room, someone is taking the first steps toward a discovery that will change the world. We don't know who it is. Perhaps they don't know either, but they exist, and that is hope. Genius is proof of what humans are capable of. It's a reminder of our potential. It's a challenge and an invitation. You don't have to be a genius, but you can strive toward your maximum, whatever it may be. You can work, learn, create, search. You can contribute, however modestly, to humanity's shared endeavor. And who knows? Perhaps among those hearing these words is a future genius, someone whose name will enter history, someone who will change our understanding of the world. I can't know who it is. You can't know. But the possibility exists, and that possibility is beautiful. We began this journey with a question: what is genius? Now we know there's no simple answer. Genius is a multifaceted crystal that sparkles differently depending on the angle of view. But one thing is clear: genius is part of human experience. It's what we're capable of. It's our heritage and our future. The universe is vast. The human mind is infinite in its potential. And our journey, in search of genius, in search of ourselves, is only beginning.